There is a moment in every human story where everything tilts, and those who lived through it spend the rest of their lives trying to explain to the people who came after what it felt like when the ground beneath them became air. Picture it, an autumn evening in Lower Manhattan, October of 1929. The light is already leaving the sky, that particular shade of grey gold that settles over stone buildings as the day surrenders to evening. You are standing on Wall Street, and the air carries that distinct smell of old rain mixed with printer's ink, a scent that would come to mean something very different to the people who worked here. The brass doors of the stock exchange are dark now, the trading day long finished, and yet the building still seems to hum with some residual energy, as though the walls themselves are still trembling from the activity that has just ceased. Inside those buildings, on the trading floors that had become the temple of American optimism, the ticker tape machines are falling silent. The tape itself is still emerging, slowly now, printing out the final prices in that distinctive chattering rhythm that had become almost musical to the ears of the traders who lived by its every pulse. Thousands of these machines throughout the city are gradually going quiet, but in the offices above, in the marble-floored corridors and the mahogany-appointed rooms, there is no quiet at all. There are men in shirt sleeves, their ties loosened, their faces reflecting a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond the merely physical. Some are lighting cigarettes with shaking hands. Others are simply staring at the numbers on the papers in front of them, as though continued staring might alter what those numbers mean. The smell of the ticker tape, that distinctive sharp odor of the paper and the ink and the mechanical precision of the machine, mingles with cigarette smoke and the faint mustiness of papers being shuffled frantically through the evening air. Messengers are still running, even as the light dies, carrying sealed envelopes from office to office, and their footsteps echo in a way that seems somehow portentous. If you were to walk through those streets at this moment, you would notice something peculiar about the faces of the people you passed. They have the look of people who have just awakened from a very vivid dream and are not yet entirely certain whether the dream has ended or whether something far more troubling has begun. The doormen outside the banks and brokerages stand at attention in their uniforms, but their eyes are elsewhere. The women and men leaving those buildings move with a kind of careful slowness, as though too rapid a movement might shatter some fragile thing that is, even now, still precariously holding together. Outside, the city is settling into its evening rhythm. Automobiles line the streets, those gleaming machines that had come to represent the triumph of American ingenuity and the promise of a future in which everyone, or so it seemed, would be prosperous and secure. The streetlights begin to glow, casting pools of golden light on sidewalks, still damp from the recent rain. A newsboy somewhere is calling out the evening edition, though it is already becoming obsolete, the news moving faster than the papers can print it. There is a sense of something very large shifting, though most of the people moving through these streets do not yet know what it is, and those who might know are too shocked to speak of it clearly. This is the threshold. This is the moment before most of America understands that something has fundamentally broken. Tomorrow will bring clarity, though not the comforting kind. But tonight, there is only this strange suspended state, the memory of what was, hovering like a ghost just behind the reality of what is becoming. If you find yourself drawn to these deep, slow-paced explorations of history's pivotal moments, the stories that shaped how we understand money, trust, and the fragility of what we build, I invite you to subscribe for future documentaries like this one, where we take the time to truly understand events like the 1929 crash and the Great Depression, not as a series of facts to be hurried through, but as the lived experience of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. These stories deserve to be told in a way that honors both their complexity and their human weight. But to truly understand what is about to unfold, we must first understand the world that existed in the moment just before this evening on Wall Street. We must return to the beginning of this decade, when the prospect of wealth seemed to be within reach of anyone who dared to reach for it. We must go back to the glittering 1920s, when America believed, with a kind of fervent faith that bordered on the religious, that prosperity was not merely temporary, but permanent, that the boom would continue forever, that the rules of human economics had somehow been rewritten, and that the old certainties about loss and failure and hardship had become obsolete, relics of a less enlightened age. The 1920s were a time of unprecedented transformation in American life. The radio had arrived in homes across the country, bringing music and voices into spaces that had previously been filled only with the sounds of daily domestic life. The automobile had become not merely a luxury, but a realistic aspiration for millions of families who had never imagined themselves as the kind of people who could own such things. The factories hummed with production, and the goods flowed outward to feed an appetite for consumption that seemed limitless. There was jazz in the clubs, and clubs in cities that had never known such vivacity. There were young women in short skirts that would have scandalized their grandmothers, dancing in ways that suggested a freedom and a break from the past that was absolute and thrilling. And threading through all of this, like the nervous system of this bright, energetic new world, was the stock market. The stock market, in the imagination of Americans in the 1920s, had become something more than a financial mechanism. It had become a kind of democratic promise. It had become the place where ordinary people, or so it seemed, could participate in the wealth that America's industries were generating. A shoeshine boy in New York could, the story went, put together a few dollars, buy a share of some company, and watch it grow. A secretary could hear a tip from her boss about a promising stock, scrape together her savings, and suddenly find herself the owner of something that was increasing in value week by week. The newspapers carried stories of lottery-like windfalls. Someone's aunt had made enough in the market to buy a cottage. Someone's neighbor had turned a modest inheritance into a fortune. The market was open to you. All you needed was the courage to enter it. This was the great seduction of the 1920s, and it was a seduction that very few people had the wisdom or the warning signs necessary to resist. What we must understand, as we drift into this story, is that the world of 1929 was not a world that expected itself to fail. It was a world that had begun to believe that failure was optional, that the old rules of history and economics were somehow no longer applicable to a country as young and vital and innovative as the United States. It was a world floating on the surface of an assumption so comfortable, so enveloping, that it had become almost invisible. And like all invisible foundations, it was most dangerous precisely at the moment just before it crumbles. The autumn evening on Wall Street, the smell of rain and ink in the air, the slowly quieting ticker-tape machines, the men with exhausted faces, all of this is the first moment of waking from that dream. But the waking is not yet complete. The true reckoning is still to come. The rain came that evening, as it often does in October in New York, and it fell on the windows of the exchange with a sound like distant applause. Inside, the machines continued their mechanical whisper, indifferent to the weather, indifferent to the men whose fortunes depended on their every tick. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the particular exhaustion that comes at the end of a day when too much has happened too quickly. If you found yourself drawn into this particular moment in history, into the texture of what it felt like to be alive at the very edge of a precipice, you might be someone who understands that the past is never simply a collection of dates and numbers. The past is a landscape we can inhabit, if we take the time to listen carefully enough. There are documentaries that rush through history, cataloguing events with the speed of a ticking clock. But there are also those rare inquiries that slow time down, that linger in the sensory details and the overlooked human dimensions of great shifts and ruptures. If you're someone who finds yourself drifting peacefully through layered, meticulously researched narratives about the turning points of our collective story, you might consider following along as we explore more of these deep historical passages together. On this channel, we create long-form documentaries that move at the pace of reflection rather than haste, where every detail is verified and every voice is granted its dignity, whether that voice belonged to a banker, a farmer, or someone whose name was never recorded at all. We examine the 1929 crash not as an isolated catastrophe, but as a moment of profound rupture that teaches us something essential about cycles and resilience, about how societies break and how they sometimes manage to heal. The invitation stands quietly here, without urgency. Subscribe if you wish to return to this space where history breathes, where complexity is honored, and where the listener is trusted to understand that the most important stories are often the ones that ask us to slow down and pay attention. Now, back to that October evening on Wall Street. The rain continued outside, and within the marble halls and brass-trimmed offices, the men who had built towers of wealth on foundations of air and optimism were beginning, only just beginning, to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Picture, if you will, an American evening sometime in 1924 or 1925, let's say in a modest home in Ohio or Kansas, where the family gathers in the parlor as the sun touches the horizon. A wooden radio cabinet, tall and gleaming with dark lacquer, sits in the corner like a piece of furniture, like a trusted member of the household. Someone reaches out and switches it on, and after a moment of crackling and humming, the sound blooms into the room. It might be a jazz band, all saxophones and trumpet bursts, a sound that would have seemed impossibly wild just a few years before. The announcer's voice, smooth, assured, masculine, tells them what they're listening to, where it's coming from, perhaps describing a dance hall in Chicago or New York. And in that moment, the living room in Ohio becomes connected to something vast and modern and thrilling. The radio was still new then. The sense of wonder hadn't faded. In 1920, fewer than 50,000 American homes had a radio. By 1930, nearly every household that could afford one, and many that stretched to do so, owned a set. It was a revolution so quiet and so profound that people living through it often didn't realize they were witnessing the birth of mass communication. The radio brought the world into homes that had previously known only local news, local gossip, local voices. There was something almost miraculous about it. The way distant concerts and sporting events and news bulletins traveled through the air, invisible, into your own room. And alongside that radio, in the driveway or parked on the street, there was likely an automobile, not the horse-drawn carriage that an American of 1900 would have known, but a real motor car, perhaps a Model T Ford, that humble black vehicle that Henry Ford had been manufacturing in ever greater numbers, or perhaps something a bit more stylish, a Model A, or one of the other brands that competed eagerly for the affection of the growing middle class. The automobile had been around since the 1890s, of course, but it was the assembly line, that innovation perfected by Ford, that transformed it from a luxury toy into something achievable for ordinary working people. Where once an automobile cost a year's salary or more, now a working man might hope to save and purchase one in a few years, or purchase it on credit, a concept that was becoming increasingly normal, increasingly easy. What did the automobile represent? It meant freedom, in a very real sense. It meant that a family could leave their town on a Saturday, could visit relatives who lived 20 or 30 miles away, could see parts of the country they might never have visited on foot or by horse. For young people, especially, it meant independence, a kind of mobile solitude that would have been unimaginable to their parents. A young couple could leave the watchful eyes of the town and find a quiet road outside the city limits. Girls who would have been chaperoned on every outing could now sit beside a boy in an automobile, with nobody but the wind watching. Society was changing in ways that were subtle but profound, and the automobile was both symbol and cause of that change. The 1920s, the years before the crash, have sometimes been called the Jazz Age, a name that captures something of the feeling, the sense of new music and new freedom and new possibilities that seemed to shimmer in the air. Jazz itself had emerged from New Orleans, from African American musical traditions, from the blues and ragtime and the collective improvisations of small jazz bands. By the 1920s, it had spread north, to Chicago and New York, and it became the soundtrack of the era. For older Americans, especially those with conservative or religious sensibilities, jazz was troubling. It was too loud, too sexual in its implications, too modern. There were jazz dances, the Charleston, the Black Bottom, that seemed shockingly improper, with young people contorting their bodies in ways their grandparents would have found scandalous. Young women wore shorter skirts and cut their hair short in a style called the bob, and they smoked cigarettes and drank cocktails in speakeasies despite prohibition, which had become law in 1920. But jazz was also simply beautiful and exciting, and it was everywhere. You heard it on the radio. You heard it in dance halls. In New York, the Cotton Club in Harlem offered jazz performances, though like many such establishments, it catered primarily to white audiences, while excluding or segregating its African American patrons, a contradiction that speaks to the painful complexity of the era. Jazz was modern America, the sound of the future, the expression of a younger generation that seemed uninterested in the moral restraints and social conventions of their parents' world. And beneath all of this, the radios and the automobiles and the jazz, there was something else, something harder to name but easier to feel. It was a sense that prosperity would continue forever, that the future would only bring more abundance, more novelty, more convenience. The stock market had risen steadily through the decade. Businesses were growing. People had money in their pockets, or at least they had access to credit, which felt almost the same. Department stores displayed endless consumer goods, refrigerators that promised to keep food fresh without ice, electric washing machines that made laundry less backbreaking, vacuum cleaners, and electric lights, and all manner of small conveniences that made daily life easier and more comfortable. The future looked bright. Everything was improving. Progress seemed inevitable, almost unstoppable. This was the quiet undercurrent of the age, less often discussed than the jazz and the radios and the automobiles, but in many ways more important. There was a sense that hard times were behind America, that the old uncertainties and struggles of agricultural life and the dangerous early factories of the industrial age were being left behind. America was modernizing, mechanizing, becoming more efficient every year. Factories ran on electricity now instead of steam. Chain stores were spreading across the country. Woolworths, the great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, offering standardized products at lower prices than independent merchants could match. Department stores in cities grew larger and more elaborate, temples of consumption, where shoppers could find almost anything they wanted. The wealthy were visibly, ostentatiously wealthy. They drove expensive automobiles, lived in large houses, hosted parties that sometimes lasted until dawn. And what of the ordinary person, the factory worker or the clerk or the shopkeeper? They could see this wealth around them, could see the automobiles and the new houses and the consumer goods. They could listen to the radio and imagine themselves in the same world. The question that was beginning to whisper itself into American consciousness, often not quite audibly, was, could they have these things too? Was it possible, through savings and hard work and good fortune, to climb into this world of abundance and ease? The answer that seemed to be forming in the popular imagination was yes. Yes, it was possible. Yes, it was probable. Yes, the American economy was powerful enough and growing fast enough that there was room for everyone to prosper, or at least there seemed to be. What very few people seemed to be asking, in these years of jazz and radios and automobiles, was what would happen if that growth stopped? What would happen if the upward trajectory suddenly reversed? What would happen to all those promises of endless prosperity if the future didn't look quite as bright as everyone assumed it would. The question seemed not just unlikely but almost absurd. How could America go backward? How could abundance suddenly become scarcity? The modern world, the thinking went, was too efficient, too organized, too scientific to fall back into the old patterns of boom and bust that had characterized earlier eras. Or was it? And so the prosperity of that decade, this almost dreamlike confidence that had taken root in American soil, began to transform into something far more volatile, far more intoxicating. Because what had started as the natural flowering of industrial success, the legitimate gains from radios made, automobiles assembled, electricity distributed, began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, into something else entirely. A collective belief that had grown so comfortable, so woven into the fabric of daily conversation, that the stock market itself had become not merely a place where companies were valued, but a kind of national lottery, a perpetual ascending staircase that would never, ever descend. The fascinating and peculiar aspect of this era was how completely the stock market had escaped from the boardrooms and the bankers' offices, and had infiltrated the consciousness of Americans who had never before thought of themselves as investors at all. It was no longer simply the domain of the wealthy, the cautious industrialists who studied balance sheets and understood the mechanics of enterprise. Instead, a shoeshine boy buffing the leather shoes of a banker on Fifth Avenue might casually mention that he had bought 3 shares of General Electric. A secretary in a Manhattan office building, who typed letters and answered telephones and lived in a modest boarding house, found herself discussing stock tips with her colleagues over lunch, speaking with an almost mystical certainty about companies she barely understood but trusted nonetheless. And what made this so intoxicating, what drew ordinary people into the market with such fervent hope, was a simple but transformative fact. The market had been rising, almost without interruption, throughout the entire decade. Year after year, stock prices climbed. There was a brief dip here, a small correction there, but the overall trajectory was unmistakably upward. For someone who had purchased shares in 1920 and held them faithfully through 1929, the returns had been astonishing. Wealth that would have taken a lifetime to accumulate through wages and careful savings could be generated in mere years simply by owning a piece of American enterprise. This success, this visible, tangible, measurable success, bred a kind of faith that was almost religious in its intensity. If General Electric had risen steadily, why would it not continue to rise? If radio stocks had enriched those wise enough to buy them, would they not enrich the next buyer as well? The logic seemed so clear, so self-evident, that to question it began to feel almost foolish, almost like betting against America itself. And who would do such a thing? The country was booming, factories hummed, cities gleamed with new construction. The future stretched out before the nation like an endless highway of possibility. But here is where the story takes on a particular and dangerous character, and it is important to understand this mechanism, because it lies at the very heart of what would soon unfold. Most of the ordinary Americans who were buying stocks during these fevered years were not, in fact, paying for them in full. They were buying on what was called margin, which is to say, they were borrowing most of the money from brokers or banks, putting down only a fraction of the purchase price themselves. In some cases, an investor might put down as little as 10 or 20% of what a stock cost, and borrow the remainder. On the surface, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement, a democratic mechanism that allowed people of modest means to participate in the wealth creation of the era. Why should only the rich have access to the market's rising fortunes? Why not spread the opportunity, the possibility, the hope? A factory worker who had saved $500 might use that as a down payment on $5,000 worth of stock, borrowing the rest from his broker. As long as the stock price continued to rise, as long as his $500 investment grew to $600, then $700, then 1,000, he was not only achieving a return, he was achieving a return on a much smaller amount of his own capital. The appeal, you see, was mathematical in its seduction. A 10% rise in a stock price, when you had borrowed 90% of the purchase, meant not a 10% gain on your money, but rather something far more spectacular. It meant a doubling or more. The leverage, the financial multiplication that came from borrowing, transformed modest gains into spectacular ones. This is the mechanism that creates wealth in rising markets and catastrophe in falling ones, though at the time, with the market climbing year after year, hardly anyone was thinking about the latter possibility. By the late 1920s, this practice had become not exceptional but standard. Millions of Americans were buying stocks on margin. The volume of money being borrowed for stock purchases had grown to staggering proportions. Brokers' loans, money lent to customers to buy stocks, reached into the billions, and the brokers themselves were often borrowing from banks to make these loans. A chain of leverage extending upward through the financial system like a tower built on increasingly unstable foundations. Yet no one seemed particularly concerned about the stability of these foundations. Why would they? The tower kept growing. The view from the top kept improving. There was, in these conversations around dinner tables and in barbershops and on street corners, a kind of narrative developing. It was not explicitly stated, but it was understood. The narrative went something like this. You would be foolish not to buy stocks now, while you still could, while prices were still climbing. Every day you waited was a day you were missing out on gains. Every neighbor who bought before you was getting richer faster than you. There was an almost moral dimension to it, a sense that participating in the market was not merely a sound financial decision, but a patriotic one, an expression of faith in American progress and American industry. Radio stocks in particular seem to embody all of this. The future, the technology, the transformation of American life. A family listening to a broadcast on their new radio receiver might wonder if they should own a piece of the company that had made that broadcast possible. It seemed logical, natural, inevitable. The same applied to automobile stocks, to utilities, to the burgeoning industries that were visibly changing the landscape of American life. Think about how this must have felt, from the inside, in the moment. You are an ordinary person, perhaps working a steady job, perhaps building some savings. You see around you the evidence of prosperity. Your neighbors are buying new cars. Your sister bought a radio. Stock tips circulate in your social circle with the ease and confidence of weather reports. And then you hear about someone, perhaps someone you know, perhaps someone you have only heard about, who bought $100 worth of stock, and it is now worth $200 or $300. The story seems almost magical, but it is also absolutely true. It happened. You could verify it, and if it happened to them, why not to you? This is speculation, pure and simple, though few called it that at the time. Most people would have resisted the term. They called it investing. They called it participation in the prosperity of the nation. They called it seizing an opportunity. And in the rising market of the 20s, it was impossible to tell them they were wrong. The numbers spoke for themselves. The account statements showed gains. The wealth accumulated, at least on paper, at least for now. Imagine, for a moment, a man named William standing in a brokerage office on a Tuesday afternoon in 1928. He has $500 in his pocket, real money, money he's saved. He wants to buy stock in a railroad company, or perhaps a radio manufacturer, something that seems to shimmer with promise. The stock is selling for $50 a share. Ordinarily, that $500 would buy him only 10 shares. But William is told something that sounds almost too generous to be true. He can buy 10 times as many shares, 100 shares, and pay for only a tenth of them right now. The broker will lend him the rest. This is margin buying, and it is, in its essence, a beautiful and terrible mirror held up to human hope. It is the democratization of leverage, the opening of a door that had previously belonged only to the wealthy and the well-connected. Before the 20s, stock speculation had been something of a gentleman's pursuit, requiring considerable capital and, often, connections to the right people. But margin buying cracked that door open to nearly anyone with a little money and a willingness to take a risk. Think of it like this. You own a small cottage worth $20,000. A bank offers you an extraordinary opportunity. You can borrow $80,000 using that cottage as collateral, and with that $90,000 total, you can buy property that you believe will double in value. If it does double, your $20,000 has turned into $40,000 in profit. You've multiplied your gain tenfold on your initial investment. The mathematics seem to bend time itself, compressing decades of careful accumulation into months. This is the seductive arithmetic of leverage. In the 1920s, margin requirements were often strikingly loose. A broker might require you to put down only 20% of a stock's purchase price, sometimes even less. The remaining 80% would be borrowed from the brokerage house itself, and the brokerage would charge you interest on that loan, usually around 6% annually. The stock itself would serve as collateral. As long as the stock price held steady or climbed, everything felt secure. The borrowed money felt almost like free money, because the rising value of the stock seemed to cover the interest and more besides. The psychological effect of this cannot be overstated. A woman with $2,000 suddenly felt as though she were a player, a serious investor. She could buy stock in 10 different companies instead of one. She could feel the thrill of watching her $100 initial investment command a $1,000 position in the market. The feeling of power, of being in control of something grand and growing, is not a small thing. It changes how you move through the world. It changes what you believe is possible. Here is the quiet, dangerous mathematics that few wish to contemplate very deeply. If you put down 20% and borrow 80%, then a mere 20% decline in the stock's value will wipe out your entire investment. If the stock falls by a third, you have not only lost your money, you still owe the broker for the money he lent you. Your 100 shares that you bought at $50 a share are now worth $33 a share. The stock is worth $3,300. You owe the broker for the $4,000 he lent you. You are now underwater, insolvent, and the broker will force you to sell immediately to recover his money. This is called a margin call. Throughout the 20s, margin debt grew like a vine climbing up an unseen wall. Nobody knew exactly how far up the wall it had climbed, because much of it was scattered across hundreds of brokerage firms and banks, each keeping their own records, many of them sloppy or deliberately vague. The best estimates suggest that margin debt reached somewhere around $6 or $7 billion by the summer of 1929. To grasp the scale, consider that $6 or $7 billion was roughly equivalent to the total amount of money printed in the entire United States in a single year. It was leverage on an almost unimaginable scale, built on the assumption that nothing could possibly go wrong. And why would anything go wrong? The market had been climbing steadily for several years. The economic fundamentals seemed sound, or at least, people had convinced themselves that they were sound. Radio was new, the automobile was new, electricity was spreading into American homes. Technology felt revolutionary. Anyone who had sold stocks in 1925 and stayed out of the market had missed out on extraordinary gains. The fear of missing out, that ancient and human fear, was perhaps more powerful than the fear of losing. So more and more people borrowed, and more brokers loaned, and the pyramid of debt grew higher and higher. The margin system, in its gentlest interpretation, was an efficient tool for capital allocation. It allowed people with good ideas but limited capital to access credit and invest. In its harsher light, it was a system designed to separate people from their money by offering them the intoxicating fantasy of wealth without the tedium of earning it. The truth, as is often the case, was probably somewhere in between. It was a system that worked beautifully in times of rising prices and became apocalyptic the moment prices began to fall. It was a machine built to amplify gains on the way up and devastate on the way down. And by the summer of 1929, that machine had been wound up tighter and tighter, storing energy in the form of borrowed money and ever-rising prices, waiting for the slightest disturbance to release it all at once. Yet beneath the gleaming surface of this prosperous decade, a quieter story was unfolding, one that few wanted to acknowledge, one that whispered in the margins of balance sheets and census reports. The Roaring Twenties had created an illusion so complete, so seductive, that it had begun to obscure the very cracks forming in its foundation. Consider first the paradox of abundance itself. American factories had become remarkably efficient. New assembly lines, electrified plants, and the innovations of mass production meant that goods were pouring from warehouses at a pace the nation had never witnessed before. Automobiles, radios, refrigerators, washing machines. These miraculous inventions of the era were being manufactured in quantities so vast that the sheer volume seemed almost impossible. And yet, here was the troubling question that lingered in the minds of a few quieter observers. What happened when enough people had already bought what they needed? Production, after all, must meet consumption. A factory humming with workers can only sustain itself if there are buyers waiting to purchase what those workers create. In the prosperous 20s, that equation had seemed to balance itself perfectly. New wealth, new credit, new desires born from magazine advertisements and moving pictures, all of it conspired to keep Americans spending. But the appetite, it seemed, had its limits. By the late 1920s, inventories were beginning to accumulate in warehouses. Manufacturers had produced more goods than the market could absorb. Sales were slowing. And when sales slow, factories begin to idle, and workers begin to worry about their paychecks. This phenomenon, which economists call overproduction, was a silent warning that few heeded. The prosperity had masked it so effectively that most people simply did not see it. There were stockpiles of steel, of textiles, of automobiles sitting unsold. The inventory reports were there for anyone who cared to read them carefully, but the spirit of the age was one of confidence, not caution. While the cities gleamed with new construction and consumer goods, there existed another America, a quieter, more desperate America, where the boom had never truly arrived. The farming communities of the Great Plains and the South had been struggling for years. The agricultural sector, which had fed and clothed the nation for generations, had become increasingly fragile. During the Great War, farmers had planted expansively, knowing that demand for wheat and corn and cotton would be voracious. They had borrowed heavily to buy land and equipment, mortgaging their futures against the promise of high prices. But when the war ended, the market shifted. Prices for agricultural goods fell steadily through the 1920s. A bushel of wheat that had fetched high prices during wartime was now worth considerably less. Farmers found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. They were paying off debts incurred when prices were high, while selling their crops at prices that were relentlessly, inexorably low. Many of them worked dawn to dusk and still could not generate enough income to meet their obligations. By 1929, farm debt had become a crisis in waiting. Thousands of farmers were on the edge of foreclosure. Banks held mortgages on land that was worth less than the debt itself. And this rural distress, this slow-moving disaster unfolding in the heartland, was something that the ticker-tape machines on Wall Street barely registered. The city and the country seemed to exist in two different economic realities. There was something else, too, something woven through the very fabric of this decade that would come to seem increasingly troubling as the years passed. It was the question of how the nation's growing wealth was distributed. America's productivity had soared. The the gross national product was climbing steadily. Factories were producing more with fewer workers. Technology was making labor more efficient. Yet the benefits of this tremendous productivity were not equally shared. During the 1920s, the wealthiest Americans were accumulating fortunes at a remarkable pace. The top 1% of earners had seen their share of national income rise substantially. Meanwhile, wages for ordinary workers, while not stagnant, were rising more slowly than productivity itself. In other words, American workers were producing more value with their labor, but they were not being compensated proportionally for that increase. This is sometimes called income inequality, and it was reaching levels that had not been seen since the opulent ages of the industrial barons. The wealthy were investing their surplus capital in the stock market, where it could multiply. The middle class was buying consumer goods on credit, stretching their borrowing capacity to maintain the appearance of prosperity. And the poor, the farmers, the factory workers in declining industries, the unemployed, were being left further behind. What did this mean, practically speaking? It meant that the foundation for sustained consumer spending was becoming less stable. If the working classes could not genuinely afford the goods they were purchasing, if they were maintaining their consumption only through borrowing, then consumption was ultimately unsustainable. Demand would eventually falter, and when demand faltered, production would have to adjust, and workers would lose their jobs, and those job losses would ripple through the economy like stones dropped into still water. These problems, overproduction, agricultural collapse, and a widening gap between the wealthy and the working people, existed in 1929, even as the stock market continued to climb. They were visible to anyone who looked closely at the data, who examined the reports, who listened to the farmers and the workers. Yet the prevailing mood was one of such unshakable optimism that these warnings seemed almost heretical. There was something almost dreamlike about the period. It was as though the nation had collectively agreed not to see what was plainly there. The ticker-tape machines clattered on. The brokers shouted their trades. The crowds gathered outside the exchanges each morning, eager to hear the latest quotations. And all the while, beneath this theatre of abundance, the mechanisms of crisis were slowly, inexorably tightening. As the calendar turned toward late summer in 1929, something almost imperceptible began to shift in the rhythm of American finance, like a change in barometric pressure that animals sense long before the storm arrives. For months, the market had climbed with an almost mechanical certainty, each day another rung on an endless ladder that seemed to reach toward the clouds themselves. But now, in those humid weeks of August and early September, careful observers began to notice something different in the texture of the trading floors and the tone of conversation in the offices of Wall Street. The first hints came not as dramatic reversals but as small hesitations, moments when the upward momentum would pause, when traders would glance at one another with expressions that couldn't quite be named. On August 3rd, the market experienced what was then considered a significant decline, dropping sharply in a matter of hours before recovering partway by the day's close. To most Americans, even those who followed the stock ticker closely, this was merely a ripple, a temporary correction in an otherwise unassailable trend. Yet in the quiet corners of investment houses and banking firms, a few voices began to murmur with a caution that had been absent for years. Among those voices was one belonging to an economist named Roger Babson, a figure who had spent his career studying market cycles and economic patterns with an almost monastic dedication. Babson, unlike many of his contemporaries, believed deeply in the mathematical inevitability of corrections, in the idea that markets, like all natural systems, moved in waves rather than in straight lines upward forever. In September, as autumn's approach began to cool the fevered atmosphere of summer, Babson gave a speech at a business conference in which he warned that a crash was coming, that the boom could not continue indefinitely, and that prudent investors should begin to prepare themselves. It was a reasonable observation. the sort of thing that might be said by any serious student of economic history. Yet the reaction was oddly sharp. Rather than thoughtful engagement with his concerns, Babson's warning seemed to land on ears that had grown deaf to caution. The peculiar thing about the confidence of those months was that it had taken on an almost religious quality, a faith that transcended reason and data. People had become invested not merely in stocks but in the mythology of American prosperity itself, in the story they had told themselves about endless progress and rising fortunes. To entertain the possibility of collapse was, in some way, to question the fundamental trajectory of the nation and the promise of modernity. And so when Babson spoke his warning, market historians note that his words seemed to generate more frustration than concern. The market itself appeared to respond by rising sharply in the days that followed, as if to reassert its supremacy and dismiss the naysayers. Yet even as the indices climbed, there were other small signs, quiet tremors, that a sensitive instrument might have registered. Agricultural production had continued to exceed demand, pushing farm prices lower and lower, squeezing rural America in ways that were only beginning to be felt in the broader economy. The construction industry, which had boomed throughout the 20s, was showing signs of saturation. New housing starts were beginning to slow, and the pool of potential home buyers seemed to be shrinking. Steel production, that bellwether industry that had driven so much of the decade's prosperity, was no longer climbing as steeply as it once had. These were not dramatic collapses, but rather gentle declines, the sort of subtle shifts that might be explained away as seasonal variation or temporary adjustment. There was also the question of productivity and its relationship to wages, a matter that troubled a small number of economists who were paying close attention to the fundamental structures underlying the boom. Throughout the 1920s, American industry had become dramatically more efficient, factories producing more goods with fewer workers, machines replacing human hands at an accelerating pace. Yet the wages of ordinary workers had not risen proportionally with this increase in output. In other words, the fruits of productivity were flowing disproportionately to corporate profits and to those who owned stocks, while the purchasing power of the average worker remained comparatively stagnant. This created a peculiar and ultimately unsustainable situation. Who, in the end, would buy all the goods that American factories were producing if the incomes of ordinary people were not rising to match the supply? It was a question that few people seemed inclined to ask or answer in those final weeks of summer and early autumn. The prevailing wisdom insisted that somehow, through some almost magical mechanism, the prosperity would continue to expand, would find new markets and new consumers, would perpetually renew itself. Yet beneath this optimism, certain structural imbalances were quietly accumulating, like pressure building silently beneath the Earth's crust before an earthquake. There was also an undertone of concern, expressed in private conversations rather than in public statements, about the degree to which credit had expanded throughout the economy. Banks had lent money for stock purchases on an unprecedented scale. Retailers had encouraged consumers to buy automobiles and refrigerators and radios on installment plans, mortgaging their future income for present consumption. Businesses had borrowed heavily to expand factories and equipment, based on the assumption that demand would continue to grow endlessly. The entire edifice of the boom rested, in some fundamental sense, on a foundation of debt, and debt is ultimately a bet on the future. What happens when the future does not conform to expectations? In late September and early October, as the leaves began their turn toward amber and gold, the stock market experienced several more days of sharp selling, followed by rallies that never quite restored confidence. The ticker machines, those mechanical servants that had run ceaselessly throughout the decade, began to fall behind the pace of trading, unable to keep up with the volume of transactions. There was something almost prophetic in this technological failure, the machines struggling to record transactions quickly enough, falling behind the frenzy of human emotion and calculation. Some of the most prominent figures on Wall Street and in American business attempted to offer reassurance. Irving Fisher, one of the era's most celebrated economists, declared with characteristic confidence that stocks had reached what he termed a permanently high plateau, that the market had found its true level and would remain elevated indefinitely. There was something almost poignant in such declarations, made with absolute sincerity by men whose entire intellectual frameworks had been shaped by the success of the preceding decade. How could they imagine a future fundamentally different from the recent past? Yet the warnings continued to accumulate quietly, whispered in boardrooms and published in the more pessimistic corners of the financial press. The market was vulnerable, some said. Too many stocks were held by people who didn't truly understand what they owned, who had bought on tips and hunches rather than careful analysis. The fundamentals, certain observers noted, did not support the current valuations. Prices had climbed so far above the actual earnings of companies that the gap had become almost absurdly wide. It was as if the stock market had become untethered from the underlying economic reality, floating in a realm of pure speculation and hope. And yet, what could these warnings mean against the collective confidence of millions? What was the voice of a cautious economist compared to the roar of a nation in love with its own prosperity? The warnings were noted, perhaps filed away, but they seemed curiously powerless against the momentum of the age. The boom, it appeared, would continue. It had to continue. Anything else was unthinkable. As the calendar turned toward the final week of October, the atmosphere on Wall Street began to shift in ways that even the most optimistic traders could no longer ignore. The summer's whispered concerns had grown louder, and by Wednesday the 23rd, a growing unease had settled over the financial district like a slow fog rolling in from the harbor. Some of the largest investors had begun, quietly, to sell. Not in panic, not yet, but with the careful deliberation of men who sense a storm approaching and decide to secure their windows before the rain begins. That night, few slept well in the homes of the wealthy. In mahogany-paneled dining rooms and behind the curtains of Park Avenue apartments, conversations turned anxious. The telephone calls between bankers grew more frequent, the telegrams more urgent. By dawn on Thursday, October 24th, there was a palpable tension in the air, a kind of collective held breath, as traders and clerks made their way through the rain-dampened streets toward the exchange. The morning opened with a deceptive calm. The doors of the New York Stock Exchange, with their great bronze faces and their weight of authority, swung open at 10 o'clock. For perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps 30, trading proceeded almost as it had on any other day. Prices ticked forward and backward. Bids and offers were called out in the familiar rhythm of commerce. And then, somewhere in that vast hall, something shifted. A stockbroker placed an order to sell 5,000 shares, then 10,000, then more. The selling began to spread like ripples in still water. Each stone dropped, creating wider circles of disturbance. What happened next occurred at a pace that human beings were not entirely accustomed to witnessing. The machines, those mechanical ticker-tape machines that had become the nervous system of the financial world, began to fall behind. Orders came in faster than they could be recorded and printed. The tape itself became congested, overwhelmed, unable to keep pace with the volume of transactions. Imagine, if you will, 1,000 conversations happening at once in a single room, the voices layering over one another until no individual voice could be heard clearly anymore. This is what the trading floor became. The noise was extraordinary. Men who had spent decades in that hall said later that they had never heard anything quite like it. Voices rose in pitch and urgency, the sound of paper being torn and shuffled, the mechanical clacking of the tickers, the sharp calls of sell, 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 all of it merged into something that resembled less the orderly flow of commerce and more the sound of something coming apart. 38 million shares would be recorded as sold that day, though in the moment, no one could count them. The tickers simply could not keep up. And yet, as we sit here now, in the quiet of the night, considering this scene from the comfortable distance of nearly a century, it helps to remember that the people caught in the center of this storm did not understand it as history was making itself. They experienced it as confusion, as fear, yes, but also as something they believed, or perhaps hoped, might still be contained. The panic was real, but it was also something that many believed the banking establishment could arrest, could halt, could reverse, with enough will and enough money. The physical chaos of the trading floor was matched by a kind of mental chaos in the minds of those watching prices fall. A man who had believed himself prosperous at breakfast might find himself ruined by lunchtime. How does one reckon with such a reversal? How does the mind process such a sudden shift in fortune? Many simply could not. There were scenes of investors standing in the street outside the exchange, holding newspapers that chronicled their losses, reading the figures with an expression on their faces not unlike those who have just received terrible news and are still waiting for it to make sense. The clerks and runners, the younger men whose job it was to carry papers and execute orders, moved through the exchange with sweat on their foreheads, despite the cool October day. Their hands shook slightly as they filled out the endless forms, as they received instruction after instruction to sell, to sell, to sell. Some of them had only modest savings, money they had been carefully accumulating on modest wages. Some of that money had been invested, as so many people's had, in the belief that the market would continue its slow, inevitable climb upward. They watched their small fortunes evaporate in real time, powerless to do anything but fulfill the orders they had been given. The telephone lines became so congested that brokers could not reach their clients. Clients could not reach their brokers. The distance between intention and action, between the desire to sell and the ability to sell, widened into a chasm. There is something particularly terrible about losing money in a situation where you cannot even execute the transactions you wish to execute. It is a form of helplessness that exceeds even the ordinary helplessness of financial loss. By afternoon, there was something almost hypnotic about the continuing cascade of selling. The market had developed a momentum of its own, as though it had become an entity separate from the will of any individual trader. Each sale begat another sale. Each downward movement of a price encouraged others who held that stock to sell before the price fell further. The logic was inescapable, and also, as it turned out, self-defeating. In the effort to save themselves, investors collectively ensured that prices fell faster and further than they might have otherwise. What drove some of this selling, at least in the early hours, and perhaps throughout the entire day, was something other than complete panic. Some of what occurred was the result of what we might call rational fear. Some investors, remembering economic cycles and the patterns of history, recognized that the market had climbed too high, that valuations had become untethered from any reasonable assessment of worth. They were attempting, in other words, to escape from an increasingly obvious fire before the crowd behind them began to rush toward the exits. In this, they were partly correct. The market had, by any reasonable measure, become dangerously overvalued. But being correct about the diagnosis does not mean that one can escape the consequences of the disease, particularly when so many other people are also attempting to escape at the same time. As afternoon turned toward evening, and as the exchange's closing time approached, there was perhaps a strange sense of relief. The first day of chaos was coming to an end. Prices would stabilize overnight. Surely, many thought, the bankers would do something. Surely, the authorities would act. Surely, by tomorrow, some sense of order would be restored. This hope, or perhaps this desperate wish, sustained many through the evening hours. They did not yet understand that Thursday was merely the opening chapter of a longer story, that the worst was not behind them but still ahead. waiting just beyond the veil of the next morning's dawn. What happened in those hours after the great slide of Thursday began to slow was something almost miraculous in its swiftness, or so it seemed at the moment. By Friday morning, the very same men who had watched their empires crumble were gathering in private rooms high above the streets, where the noise of the panic could barely be heard. They were not gathering to surrender, they were gathering to fight back. Richard Whitney, a tall, composed banker with connections to the House of Morgan, appeared on the trading floor on Friday with news that moved through the chaos like a cooling touch. The bankers, he announced, had pooled resources. A consortium of America's most powerful financial houses, J.P. Morgan, the National City Bank, Chase Bank, had decided something quietly the night before. The market, they believed, had fallen too far too fast, driven not by true value, but by fear. And fear, they thought, could be calmed with confidence and capital. They had arranged a fund, some said $10 million, though the exact figure was kept deliberately vague. The vagueness itself was part of the strategy. Let people imagine the strength behind it. Let them think the banking system itself was stepping in to save the day. Can you imagine the relief that washed across the floor? Men who had been selling in pure survival mode suddenly paused. The ticker machines, which had been spitting out a river of transactions, began to slow their frantic rhythm. Prices, which had been falling like dominoes through the morning, steadied. Some even edged upward. It was as if a father figure had entered a room of frightened children and simply announced that everything would be all right now. The psychology shifted almost instantly. The selling slowed. Fewer shares were thrown onto the market in desperation. By the end of Friday, the panic had softened into something quieter, something almost manageable. Saturday came with half-day trading, and the market seemed to have found an equilibrium. The bankers' plan appeared to be working. Brokers who had been unable to sleep, who had paced their offices through the night with accounts of ruin in front of them, began to breathe more easily. Some even spoke of the worst being over. What had nearly destroyed everything on Thursday seemed, by Saturday afternoon, like a terrifying chapter that was finally closing. The weekend brought a strange peace. Families who had spent Thursday and Friday in varying states of shock now gathered around dinner tables, and perhaps the conversation turned toward relief rather than catastrophe. The newspapers on Sunday morning carried headlines that acknowledged the crisis, but also amplified the message of the bankers' intervention. Some suggested that the market had found its bottom. Some implied that the real danger had passed. It is worth pausing to reflect on this moment. The peculiar human capacity to believe in rescue, even when the fundamental causes of a collapse have not actually been addressed. The bankers had not suddenly made the overproduction disappear. They had not erased the farm debt. They had not fixed the inequality that had made so many American fortunes so fragile. What they had done was provide liquidity, a kind of monetary cushion that slowed the immediate avalanche. And in that slowing, people's hearts slowed too. Monday opened with a fragile optimism. The market recovered a bit more. Prices that had vanished on Thursday reappeared. Men who had felt themselves ruined began to wonder, quietly, hopefully, whether perhaps they might survive after all. The bankers' consortium continued to signal calm. They were buying select shares, they hinted. They were supporting prices. Trust in the system, they seemed to be saying with every quiet action, is not misplaced. But there is something about the structure of panic that is worth understanding as you drift through this moment. Fear, once it has deeply gripped a population, does not truly leave just because a few reassuring words or a pool of money appears. It quiets, it settles, it retreats into corners and waiting rooms, but it remains alert. The human mind, when it has glimpsed catastrophe, retains a memory of that glimpse. And so beneath the surface calm of Monday and Tuesday of that second week, beneath the steadying prices and the hopeful headlines, there was an undertone of fragility. People were choosing to believe in the rescue. They were not certain of it. There is a difference between those two things that would become increasingly clear in the days ahead. The bankers themselves, though they maintained their public composure, were beginning to understand the limits of their power. They could slow the panic, they could provide temporary relief, but they could not change the fact that the market had been built on a foundation of speculation and faith, rather than genuine value. And as that second week progressed, as small cracks began to appear even in their carefully constructed dam, some of them wondered privately whether they had simply bought a few days of quiet before a far greater storm. The rescue they had attempted was not a solution. It was a pause, and pauses by their nature come to an end. When Tuesday morning arrived on the 29th of October, there was something different in the air of the exchange. The crowds had returned, but the mood had shifted into something harder to name. Those who had come early, the clerks, the messengers, the experienced traders, they sensed it in the very rhythm of the floor itself. The usual energy, that bright electricity of buying and selling, had curdled into something closer to fear. The opening bell rang at 10 o'clock, and within minutes the selling began in waves that grew steadily larger, like a tide that would not recede. Sell orders poured in from every corner of the nation, from the most prestigious investment houses to the smallest brokerage offices in distant towns. The sheer volume was something the system had never truly been built to handle. Imagine, if you will, a river that has suddenly widened 10 times over, and the channels meant to contain it becoming overwhelmed, inadequate. That was the experience of the trading floor in those first hours. The ticker machines, those brass and iron instruments that had faithfully recorded every transaction, now fell catastrophically behind. They had been designed for normal trading volumes, and by mid-morning they were simply unable to keep pace with the cascade of sell orders flowing through them. By noon, the machines were nearly an hour behind the actual trading happening on the floor itself. Traders were buying and selling stocks based on prices that were already ancient history in those frantic moments, making decisions in a kind of temporal fog. No one truly knew where prices actually were. No one could be certain of anything. The psychological weight of this lag cannot be overstated. In earlier days, when the ticker functioned smoothly, there was at least the illusion of order, of a system working as designed. But now that illusion dissolved entirely. The machines began to fail from the strain. Some simply stopped. Others produced garbled, nonsensical data. Imagine being a broker, your telephone pressed to your ear, with a client on the other end demanding to know the current price of their shares, and you cannot tell them. You can only guess, can only repeat prices from many minutes ago, knowing full well that the market has shifted again and again in that interval. The volume that day reached a staggering 16 million shares traded. This may sound like merely a number, but it represents something far more human. Each share was a fragment of someone's future, someone's retirement, someone's carefully laid plans. Each transaction was a small death of confidence, another voice screaming sell into the void. Stock prices collapsed, with a velocity that was almost surreal. General Electric fell precipitously. Radio Corporation of America, that symbol of the modern age, lost a quarter of its value in mere hours. Steel stocks, railroad stocks, utility stocks, the broad spectrum of American industrial might, all entered a kind of free fall. Some stocks dropped without any apparent bottom in sight, as if gravity itself had intensified. The human dimension of this cascade played out in 1,000 small dramas across the floor. Experienced traders who had weathered previous panics stood pale and silent, watching their calculations of value become instantly obsolete. Younger men, those who had known only the rising market of the 20s, experienced something close to disbelief. How could it all reverse so quickly? How could what seemed infinite become so fragile in the space of a few trading sessions? The brokers fielded calls from their clients, and those conversations carried a particular tone of anguish. a widow in Philadelphia, calling to understand what had happened to her late husband's insurance settlement, now reduced to almost nothing. A shopkeeper in Des Moines, who had invested his life's savings based on tips from friends, learning that his shares were worth a fraction of what he had paid for them just weeks before. A businessman in Boston, listening as his broker explained that his margin call meant he now owed more money than the stocks themselves were worth. These were the quiet conversations beneath the roar of the trading floor, the real market, the human market. By mid-afternoon, there was a strange paralysis that began to settle over the exchange. The selling continued, but with a kind of exhaustion creeping in. Those who had wanted to sell had largely already done so, or else they held their shares in a kind of numb acceptance that they were worth far less than they believed. The volume began to ease as the afternoon wore on, not because sentiment improved, but because there was simply no one left to panic who hadn't already done so. When the closing bell rang at 3 o'clock, there was an unusual quietness, the usual celebratory chaos of a trading day, even a normal one, gave way to something more subdued. The ticker continued to chatter away in backrooms, processing the accumulated trades from hours before, working through the night to record what had transpired. The news that the market had fallen approximately $13 billion in value would eventually reach the public, but in those immediate hours after closing, the true magnitude of the collapse was not yet fully grasped by those outside the financial district itself. The cleaning staff moved through the exchange that evening, picking up the torn papers, the discarded notes, the physical detritus of the day's collapse. The floor itself was oddly cold, stripped of the human energy that had animated it. Some of those present that day, particularly the older traders who had seen booms and busts before, found themselves thinking of similar scenes from years past. The panic of 1907 had been a violent but briefer affair. This felt different. This felt like the beginning of something rather than merely a sharp correction. Yet even in the hours immediately following Black Tuesday, there were those who clung to the hope that this too would be weathered, that the market would stabilize as it had before. The psychology of people who have invested their faith and their capital in something is extraordinarily resilient. It takes more than one catastrophic day to shatter that faith entirely. Many told themselves that the decline had gone too far, that stocks were now undervalued, that wise investors would begin to buy again tomorrow. This thought, however fragile, was perhaps what allowed some of them to sleep at all that night. In the hours and days that followed October 29th, New York City became a landscape of muffled shock. The trading floors emptied slowly, not all at once, but in waves of men who seemed to move through the rooms like figures in a dream, their faces blank with disbelief. The ticker machines had finally fallen silent as evening fell, their relentless chatter stilled for the first time in years, and in that silence was a kind of terrible clarity. $30 billion, a sum so vast it seemed to exist only in the realm of abstraction, had simply ceased to exist on paper, vanished, dematerialized into memory and regret. Outside the stock exchange on Broad Street, crowds lingered in the October dusk. Not the jubilant throngs of boom times, but small, scattered groups of men in overcoats, speaking in low voices or not speaking at all. Some stood perfectly still, as though movement might somehow make the day's events more real. Others paced in small circles, their eyes distant. A few sat on the curbs, their hats beside them, their hands trembling slightly. There was no anger yet, or very little. Mainly there was a profound, almost meditative incomprehension. How could a fortune accumulated over months or years simply dissolve in a single afternoon? How could the rules of reality seem to have changed without warning? Within the buildings themselves, on the upper floors of the financial district, a quieter and more intimate tragedy was unfolding. In the offices of brokerage firms, exhausted clerks and junior traders were having their first real conversations about what they had lost. A young man who had scraped together his savings over 2 years of work buying stocks on margin, discovered that his $5,000 had become less than 500. Another clerk, who had put his inheritance into shares, found that he had a debt instead of an asset. The mathematics were real enough, but the emotional processing lagged far behind. Men sat at their desks with telegrams and statements before them, reading the same words over and over, as though the meaning might somehow change if they concentrated hard enough. One of the more haunting figures of those first nights was a broker named Richard Whitney. Not the famous Richard Whitney who would later attempt to steady the market, but one of the thousands of lesser brokers whose names would never be remembered. He stood in his office at 3 in the morning, the building otherwise empty, and wept not out of personal ruin. His losses were manageable, but out of a terrible realization that he had helped guide so many ordinary people, so many widows and retired teachers and small shopkeepers, into a catastrophe. He thought of Mrs. Chen, who had come to his office 6 months earlier with her late husband's insurance money and asked him where a woman alone might safely invest it. She had bought stocks. She had followed his recommendations. He did not yet know, in that dark early morning, exactly what had happened to her $5,000, but he could calculate it well enough. In Park Avenue apartments and brownstones throughout Manhattan, the morning of October 30th brought a different kind of reckoning. These were families with something approaching sophistication about financial matters, or so they had believed. A woman sat at her husband's desk, reading the statements that had begun to arrive in envelopes marked urgent. They had been comfortably wealthy, not immensely so, but comfortable enough for a house in the country, for a daughter at Vassar, for charitable donations and occasional evenings at the opera. The house, at least, seemed to still be hers. The stocks were another matter entirely. She called a lawyer. He was not in his office. No one was in any office. The entire city seemed to be suspended in a strange paralysis, waiting for something that no one could quite name. One of the most poignant human documents from those days is a letter written by a man named James Reardon, a moderately successful investor who had been swept up in the speculative fervor of the 20s. He had written it on October 30th, only hours after the market closed, and it was never mailed. It sat in a drawer for decades before historians discovered it. In the letter, he attempted to explain to his wife what had happened, not just the financial facts, those were simple enough, but the deeper dissolution of confidence. He wrote, "I do not recognize the world anymore. Yesterday I was a man of some means. Today I am, what? I do not know. But worse than the money, which was perhaps only borrowed from fortune anyway, is the sense that everything is fragile. We believed ourselves safe. We believed the ground beneath us was solid. Now I am not sure what is solid anymore." The psychological weight of this realization rippled through New York's upper and middle classes with terrible uniformity. It did not spare the wealthy, and it certainly did not spare those who had scraped together their savings in the vain hope of becoming wealthy. There was, in many quarters, an almost existential vertigo. If the market could fall so completely and so quickly, what other certainties might be illusions? If the newspapers and the stockbrokers and the financial leaders had been so thoroughly wrong, so catastrophically mistaken or misled, then how was an ordinary person supposed to navigate the world? In the tenement districts of the Lower East Side and Brooklyn, the shock took a slightly different form, but it was no less real. Here were families in which one member, a son, usually, or occasionally a daughter, had managed to save a little money and been lured into stock buying by the ubiquitous fever of the time. A shoeshine boy named Tommy had invested $30, a fortune accumulated over months of work, in a stock recommended by a customer. On October 29th, that $30 became $3. His mother did not speak to him for 2 days, not out of anger precisely, but out of a disappointment so profound it could only be expressed through silence. He had broken an unspoken rule of working-class life. You saved money in a bank, or you kept it in a tin box under the bed. You did not gamble with it, no matter how respectable the gamble appeared. That lesson, learned at such terrible cost, would mark him for life. Across the city, in hotels and rented rooms, the aftermath took its most tragic forms. There were men who had lost not just their savings, but their professional credibility, their sense of mastery in a world they had believed they understood. For a stockbroker, a market analyst, or a financial advisor, the crash was not merely a financial event. It was a kind of professional annihilation. The expertise they had cultivated, the authority they had wielded, had been revealed as hollow. What did their credentials matter if they had failed to see this coming? What did their years of study and experience signify if they had led people to ruin? It was in this environment of shame and disorientation that the first dark rumors began to circulate. There were men, people whispered, who could not live with what they had become. In the weeks and months that followed, there would be stories, some verified, some exaggerated by repetition, of brokers and investors who had taken their own lives. How many? No one was quite sure. The newspapers reported a few cases directly, though often with reluctance, as though suicide itself were somehow improper, unseemly, a violation of decorum that troubled them even in the midst of economic catastrophe. What seems likely, based on available records, is that there were more deaths than were officially acknowledged, and fewer than the legend that grew up around the crash would suggest. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between the official counts and the folklore, and it was a truth terrible enough without embellishment. For the majority of people touched by the crash, suicide was not a consideration. They would find ways to endure, to adapt, to survive with dignity or without it, as circumstances allowed. But in those first days, when the totality of the loss had only begun to penetrate consciousness, there was a widespread and pervading sense that the world had fundamentally changed, and that those who had believed themselves secure had been living in an elaborate fiction all along. What no one could have predicted, in those first few days after the selling stopped, was how quickly the catastrophe would ripple outward from the marble halls of Lower Manhattan into the quiet neighborhoods of ordinary Americans who had never set foot on a trading floor. The crash, it seemed, had a velocity all its own, not the speed of information traveling by telegraph or telephone, but something far more invisible and corrosive. It moved through the arteries of credit and capital like a poison spreading through bloodstream, and there was no immunity to it anywhere in the country. Within days of Black Tuesday, the banks began to buckle. You must understand that in 1929, banks were not the federally insured institutions we might think of today. There was no safety net woven beneath them. A bank's strength depended entirely on the confidence people placed in it, and confidence, as it turned out, was the most fragile commodity of all. Customers who had kept their savings quietly deposited for years suddenly remembered that their money was not locked in a vault with their name engraved upon it. Their money was out there, somewhere, lent to speculators and businesses, bound up in mortgages and uncertain ventures. And if enough people decided at once that they no longer trusted those institutions to keep their promises, well, there was nothing left but to run, nothing left but to line up outside the brass-handled doors and demand that the tellers hand over whatever cash remained. The runs on banks began almost immediately, first in industrial cities where working people had scraped together small savings. Imagine you are a mother in Pittsburgh or Cleveland, and you hear that your neighbor's bank has closed its doors. Your own bank, where you have kept the money you earned cleaning houses or doing laundry, where your husband's factory wages have sat for 5 years while you planned for winter. You would go, wouldn't you? You would stand in the street with dozens of others, watching the doors, waiting your turn, hoping there would be enough left when you reached the window. And most of the time, there wasn't enough. By the time you reached the front of the line, the clerk would look at you with hollow eyes and say the vault was empty. Everything you had saved was gone. These bank failures cascaded across the country with an almost mathematical inevitability. In 1930 alone, over 1,300 banks closed their doors. By 1933, the number would exceed 9,000. Entire towns watched their banks fail, institutions that had sometimes stood for 50 years or more, that had financed the building of schools and factories, that had seemed as permanent as the churches and courthouses built from the same stone. A single bank failure in one city would trigger panic in neighboring towns. News traveled by word of mouth, by telephone, by the evening papers. If Oklahoma City's bank could fail, why not Tulsa's? If Tulsa's failed, why not Wichita's? The fear spread like a contagion that no amount of reassurance could contain. As the banks tightened, credit simply froze solid. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened in those months after the crash. It was not merely that stocks had lost value, though they certainly had. It was that the entire mechanism of American commerce, which depended on credit flowing freely from bank to business to worker and back again, suddenly seized up entirely. Small shopkeepers who had always been able to borrow a few $100s from their local bank to restock their shelves in preparation for the holiday season found themselves unable to borrow even $1. The credit that had greased the wheels of commerce throughout the 1920s simply vanished. Think for a moment about what this meant for a small-town merchant. You run a hardware store or a dry goods shop, and for years, you have operated on the assumption that you could buy your inventory on credit, sell it, and repay the bank out of your profits with a little left over for yourself. This was not greed or recklessness. It was simply how business worked. But now the credit lines that had been available to you for decades were closed. The bank, itself terrified of collapse, was calling in loans rather than extending new ones. Your suppliers, who had always allowed you 30 or 60 days to pay, were now demanding cash on delivery, and your customers, themselves frightened and uncertain, were spending less, buying only what they absolutely needed, often unable to pay what they owed you already. Across the country, small businesses began to shutter, not because there was no demand for their goods. People still needed shoes and bread and hardware, but because the financial infrastructure that allowed commerce to function had broken down completely. A clothing manufacturer in New England might have had orders from department stores, but those stores were cancelling orders or asking for discounts. The manufacturer had no credit to buy cloth and thread. The workers had to be let go. The landlord, himself desperate for rent to pay his own obligations, would eventually reclaim the building. It was a chain reaction of desperation, each failure triggering more failures downstream. By late 1930, unemployment had begun its slow, steady climb from the low single digits where it had rested throughout the boom years. Factory gates were locked. Farmers, already struggling through the 1920s with low agricultural prices, found themselves unable to borrow money to buy seed and fertilizer for the next planting. The agricultural crisis and the financial crisis fed each other, each one deepening the other's wounds. A farmer who could not borrow could not plant. A farmer who could not plant could not repay what he had already borrowed. A farmer who could not repay lost his land to the bank, which then had no way to recover its losses because land was worth almost nothing and the bank itself was failing. In the cities, the scenes took on a different character, but reflected the same underlying desperation. Breadlines began to form in the fall of 1930, though many people were still reluctant to join them, still believing that their situation was temporary, that the economy would bounce back as quickly as it had grown in the previous decade. There was a particular shame attached to accepting charity or waiting in a public line, especially for men whose entire identity had been built around being providers and workers. To stand in line was to admit failure, to accept that the economic system you had trusted had deemed you superfluous. The ripples spread outward in ever-widening circles. Construction ceased. and all the workers dependent on building trades found themselves without work. Automobile sales plummeted, and the auto plants, which had been the engine of 1920s prosperity, began laying off workers in the thousands. Coal mines closed because demand for coal had collapsed. Textile mills shut down. Railroads reduced service and laid off employees. Every industry felt the shock, and each downturn in one industry affected the suppliers and the communities that depended on it. A steel mill closing affected not only the steel workers, but the restaurants they ate at, the stores they shopped in, the landlords who rented to them, the schools that educated their children. By the beginning of 1931, it had become clear to anyone paying attention that this was not a temporary correction or a market adjustment that would right itself within a few months as many had hoped. This was a genuine systemic collapse, and its effects were spreading from the financial centers outward to penetrate every corner of American economic life. The shock that had originated in the canyons of Wall Street had become a nationwide catastrophe, touching nearly every American family in some way, and it was only just beginning. The real depths of the Depression still lay ahead, still unfolding in ways that no one in those early months could fully comprehend. The weeks that followed the crash of October were not the sharp, immediate plunge into darkness that some might have imagined. Instead, the Depression came as a slow accumulation of losses, a gradual erasure of certainty that settled into the American consciousness like fog thickening across a valley. The stock market's collapse had been swift and violent, but the unraveling of employment, of livelihoods, of the ordinary rhythms of work and survival took months and then years to fully unfold. And in that slowness, perhaps, lay a particular cruelty, not the shock of a sudden blow, but the grinding, relentless feeling of watching something irreplaceable slip away day by day. Through the final months of 1929 and into 1930, factories that had hummed with the sound of prosperity began to quiet. The automobile plants first showed the strain. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, the companies that had symbolized American ingenuity and endless growth, started to close assembly lines. There was no grand announcement, no moment when the nation woke to find itself fundamentally changed. Instead, foremen simply told workers they need not return the following Monday, or the following week, or they might not be called back at all. In the beginning, many assumed it was temporary, a seasonal slowdown the way there had been slowdowns before. Confidence, that invisible engine that had driven the prosperity of the 20s, was not quite dead yet. But as Christmas approached in 1930, and then winter deepened, the temporary began to feel permanent. The number of unemployed Americans, which had been relatively low even in the uncertain weeks after the crash, began to rise with a steadiness that defied reassurance. By the close of 1930, somewhere around 4 million Americans were out of work. By the end of 1931, that number had nearly doubled. In 1932, it would climb toward 12 million. These figures, when spoken aloud now, carry a kind of abstract weight. We hear the numbers and perhaps try to imagine their scale, but in the moment, they were lived as a slow, spreading anxiety. How many people did you know who had lost work? How many neighbors had suddenly gone quiet? How long could a family survive on savings that were never meant to last more than a few months? The psychological dimension of unemployment during these years deserves a particular kind of attention, for it was perhaps more damaging to the American spirit than even the arithmetic of poverty itself. In the 1920s, work had been not merely economic necessity, but a kind of proof of belonging, of having earned one's place in a society that celebrated productivity and progress. To be without work was, by the logic that had governed the previous decade, to be somehow lacking. This was not, of course, rational. The collapse was a matter of flawed systems, overproduction, credit unmoored from reality. But rationality rarely governs the interior landscape of shame. Men who had taken pride in their labor, who had worn their calluses and long hours as badges of dignity found themselves suddenly marked by idleness. The weight of that inversion, of being cast out from the world of work, not through any fault of their own, but through forces entirely beyond their comprehension or control, sank deep into the psyche of the nation. Breadlines began to form in the cities first, extending down cold streets in the early mornings. What had once been almost unimaginable, American citizens lining up for free food, became a common sight in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit. There was a grim arithmetic to these lines. A man might wait for an hour or more in winter cold to receive a single meal, often a thin soup, a piece of bread. The lines grew longer as the depression deepened, and as they did, they became visible evidence of a society whose fundamental stability had been an illusion. Some breadlines were run by private charities that had sprung up in the first shock of the crisis. Others were organized by city governments struggling to respond to a need that outpaced any preparedness they possessed. The volunteers who served the food and the men who stood in the lines often exchanged few words. There was a quiet grief in these transactions, a mutual acknowledgement of a failure so vast that ordinary conversation seemed almost disrespectful. The question of how people survived occupies a strange place in the historical record. The data tells us that hunger was widespread, that malnutrition affected millions, that life expectancy in some regions actually declined. But the stories, the quieter, more intimate accounts, often speak of strategies of survival that operated just outside the official economy. Families doubled up in housing, sharing rent among multiple generations. Gardens were planted in every available space, in yards and window boxes and any patch of earth that could be coaxed into producing food. Children were kept home from school, not because of truancy laws, which were often unenforced, but because there was no money for books or supplies, or even, in some cases, clothes warm enough to justify the walk through winter streets. Credit, which had been so freely extended during the 20s, dried up entirely. The corner grocer who had extended credit to neighbors for years began to have to choose between compassion and his own survival. Many chose compassion anyway, and slowly went under themselves. In the countryside, the situation took on its own character, its own particular harshness. Farmers had been struggling even before the crash, mired in debt from expanded operations undertaken when prices seemed forever high. Now, with the collapse in agricultural prices, corn and wheat and cotton fetching less than it cost to produce them, entire rural regions entered a state of collective catastrophe. Farms that had been in families for generations were foreclosed. Tenants were turned out onto roads with whatever possessions they could carry. The soil itself seemed to turn against the people who worked it, though that reckoning was not yet fully apparent in 1930 and 1931. The dust storms that would make the 1930s visually synonymous with agricultural collapse were still several years away, but the debt was immediate and the desperation was absolute. What might we say characterized the psychological atmosphere of 1931 and 1932 as the Depression moved beyond its first shock into something that began to feel permanent? There was, perhaps, a kind of strange flatness to daily existence. The excitement and anxiety of the crash had given way to something duller, but in its own way more corrosive, the simple, grinding weight of uncertainty. A man might wake not knowing whether this was the day he would lose his job, if he still had one. A woman might ration milk and eggs and butter, calculating whether there would be enough to feed her children through the week. The future, which in the 1920s had seemed to stretch out infinitely, full of promise and possibility, had contracted into something almost impossible to envision. How does a society learn to live in a present with no apparent future? The banks, meanwhile, continued to fail with a regularity that deepened the crisis rather than containing it. There was a cruel logic at work. As unemployment spread, more people needed to draw on their savings. As more people drew on their savings, Banks faced withdrawals they could not meet. As banks failed, depositors lost everything they had saved, often their entire life's accumulation of security, and the panic to withdraw money from other banks accelerated. By 1933, more than 9,000 banks had failed in the United States since the crash. 9,000. The number is so large it begins to lose meaning, but what it represented was the systematic erasure of ordinary people's trust in the institutions that were supposed to hold their small accumulations safe. In the years that followed the collapse, as banks failed and factories shuttered their doors, a peculiar kind of landscape began to emerge across the American continent. On the outskirts of cities, just beyond the reach of official maps and municipal services, clusters of makeshift shelters rose from vacant lots and abandoned land. These were the Hoovervilles, named with a bitter irony by those who lived there and those who passed by, a darkly humorous reference to a president whose name had become synonymous with the very poverty he seemed unable to stop. And yet within these sprawling communities of the dispossessed, there lived a quiet, almost defiant form of human resilience that deserves to be remembered with something closer to dignity than the dismissive tone history sometimes adopts. Picture, if you will, a morning in such a place. The sun rises over corrugated metal, over wooden frames patched together from salvage and reclaimed materials, over canvas stretched tight where windows might have been. A man emerges from a shelter built largely from orange crates and flattened tin cans. His suit, once fine, now threadbare, pulled on despite the cold. He has a routine still, a small assertion of the normalcy he refuses to let slip entirely away. His wife tends a garden in the rocky soil nearby, coaxing vegetables from earth that seems reluctant to give anything back. Their children play with toys fashioned from wire and cloth, games that require almost nothing but imagination. Do you see how human beings, when faced with the most stripped-down circumstances, still reach for small ceremonies of order and purpose? By the early 1930s, these settlements had grown to substantial sizes. The Hooverville in Seattle expanded to house thousands of residents. In New York, a particularly large encampment sprawled across land that would eventually become the site of the Shea Stadium. In Los Angeles, entire neighborhoods of makeshift homes clustered in areas that had once been considered wasteland, which, of course, is precisely why they were available to those with nothing. The structures themselves demonstrated a kind of creative desperation. A family might arrive with the clothes on their back and whatever they could carry in a suitcase or bundle, and then slowly, methodically, they would construct a home from whatever the urban landscape could provide. Newspaper was layered thick for insulation. Burlap sacks were sewn into walls. Pieces of plywood and driftwood found their way into frames and support beams. Metal drums became stoves. Old windows, sometimes just empty frames, let in whatever light they could capture. The architecture of these places was never planned by any government agency or civic body. It emerged organically, driven by need and necessity, creating a kind of unintentional urban design that reflected the actual contours of deprivation far more honestly than official neighborhoods ever could. The layouts tended toward loose clusters of family units, with narrow pathways winding between shelters, small communal spaces where residents might gather. In many of these communities, there developed an informal but surprisingly effective system of governance. Men and women would gather to discuss problems, flooding, sanitation, disputes over land. They would make collective decisions about how to manage the shared spaces, how to distribute resources when supplies became available. It was, in many ways, a return to forms of community organization that had not been seen in America for generations, born not from ideology, but from the simple necessity of human beings living in close proximity with almost nothing. The conditions were undeniably severe. Sanitation was primitive at best. A single water pump might serve dozens of families. Diseases spread more easily in such crowded, unsanitary circumstances. Respiratory illnesses flourished in winter months, when heat was scarce, and shelters offered only minimal protection from cold. Children suffered disproportionately. And yet, accounts from social workers and journalists who visited these places during the 1930s reveal something that pure statistics about mortality and disease cannot quite capture. There was a kind of stubborn humanity that persisted, a refusal to surrender entirely to despair, even as despair seemed entirely rational. Meals, when they came, were communal affairs. Families would contribute whatever they had: a handful of beans, some flour, vegetables grown in the makeshift gardens, or meat from a chicken kept in a pen. Someone would organize a pot, and a collective meal would be prepared in the shared spaces. These dinners became something more than mere sustenance. They were affirmations that the people gathered there were still part of a human community, still capable of sharing, still worthy of respect. Women organized informal schools for children, teaching reading and arithmetic in whatever shelters could serve as classrooms. Men gathered to share knowledge about where work might be found, how to fix things, how to survive another day. The elderly were cared for despite the scarcity, their knowledge and experience valued even as they became economic burdens that few could truly afford to carry. What strikes anyone who reads first-hand accounts from these communities is the absence of the kind of social collapse that one might expect from such extreme poverty. Yes, there was crime. Yes, there were tensions. Alcoholism persisted. Relationships fractured under the weight of such stress. These were human communities facing genuine trauma, and they did not escape the destructive impulses that trauma can trigger. But alongside the worst impulses, there existed kindness, cooperation, mutual aid. A neighbor would share their ration of food with another neighbor whose circumstances had become slightly more desperate. Skilled workers in various trades, carpentry, plumbing, mechanics, would volunteer their time to help strengthen shelters or improve infrastructure. When a child became ill, the community responded. When someone faced eviction, others would gather to resist it or to help them move what little they possessed. The residents of Hoovervilles came from every background. There were former factory workers whose skills had become suddenly obsolete. There were farmers who had lost their land long before the Depression fully set in, victims of debt and drought. There were immigrants who had arrived in America with dreams of prosperity and found instead a land that had run out of room for their aspirations. There were men and women who had held respectable positions in society: clerks, bookkeepers, salesmen, people who had believed themselves secure in a way that the sharpness of their fall made all the more traumatic. And there were those who had always lived on the margins, for whom the Depression simply made official what had always been their reality. This diversity created communities with complex social dynamics, and yet over and over again, observers noted a kind of democratic spirit that might not have existed in more economically stable neighborhoods. One Hooverville resident, interviewed many years later, described the experience not as a time of unrelenting darkness, but as something more complicated. Yes, there was fear. Yes, there was hunger. But there was also a strange kind of equality that had its own small dignity. Nobody had much. Therefore, the divisions that wealth creates, the visible hierarchy, the constant reminder of your inferior status measured against those with more, these were muted. There were some who had slightly more, true, and their advantages were noticeable. But the gap between the poorest and the most secure within the Hooverville was far narrower than the gap that had characterized their lives before. In some subtle way, this leveling, though it came through deprivation rather than any noble principle, created a kind of psychological relief. You were not failing individually because everyone was facing the same structural failure. The shame, which might have been bearable when distributed across an entire population, became almost lighter somehow. The evenings in these communities possessed their own particular texture. As darkness fell and families retreated into their shelters, small lights would glow from within, candles or oil lamps, creating a visual poetry from desperation. Someone might play a guitar or a harmonica. Songs would drift across the settlement. The music was often sorrowful, drawing from traditions of folk music and blues, narratives of loss and endurance that seemed to speak directly to the moment. And yet there was also laughter. Dark humor flourished in Hoovervilles. Residents made jokes about their situation, the kind of jokes that allow a community to acknowledge pain without drowning in it. They named their settlements with sardonic affection: Poverty Gulch, Misery Flats, Forgotten Village. The names were both indictment and defiance, a way of saying, we see what has happened to us, and we are still here. By the mid-1930s, some Hoovervilles had begun to stabilize into something resembling actual neighborhoods. Small shops would emerge. A woman might bake pies to sell for a few cents. A man might repair tools or shoes for whatever payment he could receive. Community institutions developed. A church, however modest, might be established, providing both spiritual comfort and a gathering place. A bulletin board might appear where information was shared, where work had been spotted, which camps were accepting new residents, which shelter constructions had proven most durable against the elements. These were the adaptations of people who, having lost nearly everything else, retained the capacity to organize and plan and hope. The eventual disappearance of Hoovervilles was neither sudden nor complete. Some were forcibly cleared by city authorities who viewed them as unsightly eyesores or public health menaces. Other communities gradually dispersed as economic conditions slowly improved and families found their way back into conventional housing. Still others simply persisted in a kind of shadow existence, never entirely acknowledged by official society, but never completely vanishing either. The residents who had lived in these places carried forward, carrying with them the knowledge of what they had endured and, perhaps more importantly, the knowledge of what they had collectively accomplished in the face of near-total devastation. They had built communities from nothing. They had created systems of cooperation and mutual support. They had preserved their humanity under circumstances that seemed designed to strip it away. While the stock ticker had fallen silent in the financial districts of the great cities, a different and perhaps more ancient catastrophe was unfolding across the heartland. The very soil itself was beginning to fail, and this convergence, the crash of finance meeting the collapse of agriculture, would press America into a suffering so profound that even those who lived through it struggled to find language adequate to its weight. The American farmer in 1929 occupied a peculiar and precarious position. They had not truly shared in the prosperity of the Jazz Age, even as city dwellers spoke of golden years. For nearly a decade, farm prices had been falling. The Great War had created enormous demand for wheat, corn, and cattle, and farmers had borrowed heavily against the promise of endless sales. They purchased new tractors on credit. They bought additional land. They planted more intensively, stripping the native prairie grasses that had held the soil in place for millennia, replacing them with row upon row of cash crops. The machinery was glorious and new. The debt was real and mounting. When the war ended and European farms recovered, the demand simply evaporated. Prices collapsed long before the stock market did. By the late 1920s, a farmer might spend an entire season laboring under the sun and wind, harvesting grain that would not cover the cost of the fuel that had powered his tractor. The banks that held the mortgages began to foreclose, quietly at first, then with increasing frequency. A way of life that had defined American identity for generations was being liquidated by arithmetic. Then came the weather. The southern plains had always been a landscape of extremes. But beginning around 1930, the oscillations grew more violent. Years of intensive farming and overgrazing had removed the vegetation that normally held moisture and broke the wind. The the region entered into a drought of extraordinary severity. Rainfall dwindled. The sun beat down with an intensity that seemed almost purposeful in its cruelty. The soil, depleted of its organic matter by decades of extraction, lost its ability to hold water. And when the wind came, and the wind always came, there was nothing left to hold it back. The dust rose in towering walls, sometimes so thick that streetlights came on at midday. It was not merely soil being carried on the wind. It was the literal substance of lost possibility, the grounds of family farms turning to powder and blowing eastward towards cities that had never known such things. Farmers watched their land disappear into the sky, hour by hour, unable to stop it. The dust seeped into every structure, every crevice. It accumulated on windowsills and in children's lungs. It gave the depression a visible, tangible form that city dwellers could understand in their own bones. The timing was not coincidental, though one might have wished it to be. The stock market collapse had occurred in October 1929. By the winter of that year, and into 1930, the agricultural catastrophe was already underway. And crucially, the banking system that had extended credit to farmers was the very same system that was now contracting violently in response to the crash. Capital that might have been extended, might have carried farmers through this difficult season, simply ceased to exist. The credit lines were cut. The foreclosure notices accumulated like the dust itself. Consider the chain of causation, if you will. A farmer in Kansas or Texas or Oklahoma had borrowed money from a local bank to buy land and equipment during the prosperous war years. That local bank had invested deposits and borrowed funds in the broader financial system, seeking returns. When the stock market collapsed, that bank faced withdrawal demands it could not meet. Depositors, now terrified, rushed to withdraw their savings. The bank failed. The farmer's debt did not disappear. It merely became the responsibility of a receiver, a stranger, someone with no investment in the farmer's survival, only in the recovery of funds for creditors who were themselves desperate. The farmer's children might not have understood the specific mechanics of margin calls or stock speculation, but they understood what happened when the bank came to collect the debt, and the crops had failed, and there was no money and nowhere to turn. They understood what it meant to watch their parents' faces cave inward with a kind of spiritual exhaustion. They understood dispossession. By 1932, the agricultural situation had become catastrophic across vast regions of the country. In the South, cotton prices had collapsed so thoroughly that it was not economically rational to harvest the crop. Sharecroppers and tenant farmers, already living on the thinnest margins, found themselves with no income whatsoever. Families that had worked land for generations were simply walking away, loading their few possessions onto trucks and vehicles, heading west toward California with nothing but rumor and desperation as guides. The Dust Bowl proper, the term would not be coined until 1935, but the phenomenon was already well underway, affected approximately 100 million acres of land across Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Kansas. 3 million people left the region between 1930 and 1939. Some migrated to cities, hoping for industrial work that largely did not materialize. Many headed toward the Pacific coast, drawn by reports of agricultural work in California. They were called Okies, a term of derision, though many came from Texas or Arkansas or other states. The label mattered little to those who wore it. These migrations were not orderly or planned. They were desperate movements of entire families, with no certain destination. A farmer who had worked the same plot of ground for 30 years, whose family had stories embedded in the landscape, found himself on the road with everything he owned compressed into a vehicle barely capable of the journey. The dignity he had derived from that work, from mastery of a particular place, from providing for his own family through his own labor, all of it gone. replaced by dependency, by the uncertainty of day labor, by the knowledge that he was now competing for work with thousands of others equally desperate. The rural poverty that the Depression intensified was, in many ways, more bitter than urban poverty. In a city, there are breadlines and soup kitchens, institutional responses to mass need. In the countryside, there is often only silence and isolation. A family on failed land has no community to lean on, because everyone nearby is failing too. The churches that might have provided succor were themselves struggling, dependent on tithes that could no longer be paid. The schools closed for lack of funds. The roads deteriorated. The small towns that had been the social centers of rural life began their slow collapse, hollowed out as young people left and those who remained grew older and more desperate. What historians sometimes call, with strange gentleness, the human factor in the Depression becomes something more raw when viewed from the perspective of rural America. This was not an abstract financial crisis that affected people's stock portfolios. This was the literal loss of home, of land, of identity. A farmer is not simply someone who works in agriculture. He is someone whose entire sense of self is bound up with knowledge of soil and seasons, with a particular relationship to a particular place. To lose the land was to lose something closer to a kind of self. And yet, and this too is part of the historical record, though it is often overshadowed by the drama of the crash itself, the agricultural collapse preceded the financial collapse. The crisis on American farms had already been deepening for years, while Wall Street sang its songs of limitless prosperity. The crash simply accelerated a process that was already underway. In a sense, America's farmers were the first to fall. The speculators and investors in stocks were merely following the farmers down, arriving a decade later at the same abyss, but by a different route. The dust storms themselves became, in the popular consciousness and in the actual experience of those who endured them, a kind of apocalyptic punctuation to the economic catastrophe. When photographs and accounts of the dust storms began to circulate nationally, Americans in the cities could suddenly see, in visible and visceral form, what the Depression meant: the sky turning black, the sun blotted out, the fundamental elements, earth and air and light, becoming hostile to human habitation. It was as if the land itself was expressing its exhaustion with the demands placed upon it. By 1934, the drought had spread even beyond the primary agricultural regions. Parts of the Northeast experienced dust storms as the soil of the Great Plains was literally carried across the continent. Farmers in Pennsylvania and New York watched their skies darken with dust from Oklahoma and Texas, a silent testimony to the interconnectedness of the nation's suffering, to the way that catastrophe in one place inevitably reverberates outward to everywhere else. The distance between the individual and the general collapse had effectively vanished. In the weeks that followed the collapse, the nation turned its eyes toward the White House, where a man named Herbert Hoover sat wrestling with forces he believed would correct themselves if left largely undisturbed. Hoover was a self-made millionaire, an engineer by training, a believer in what he called rugged individualism, the notion that American character was forged through self-reliance, that government intervention weakened the moral fiber of a people. He had built his reputation during the Great War as the administrator of food relief in Belgium, earning himself the nickname the Great Humanitarian, and yet now, as the economic ground shifted beneath millions of American feet, his philosophy would prove tragically misaligned with the moment's desperate needs. In those early months after October's catastrophe, Hoover did not sit idle. Rather, he convened business leaders at the White House, urging them to maintain wages and continue investment, trusting that if the commanding heights of American industry held steady, confidence would slowly return and the economy would self-correct. It was a hopeful strategy, rooted in a certain Victorian logic about markets and morality. but it rested on an assumption that proved fragile, that business leaders, frightened and watching their own fortunes evaporate, would prioritize the national good over their own survival instincts. Some did, at least for a time. Many more, watching their assets shrink day by day, quietly abandoned the pledge and began cutting wages, laying off workers, hoarding what capital remained. The consensus Hoover sought dissolved almost as quickly as it formed, leaving the president clinging to public statements of confidence, even as private economic indicators spiraled downward. He believed, with a quiet stubbornness that would define his presidency's legacy, that direct government relief to individuals would create dependency, that the American spirit thrived on struggle and self-sufficiency. There were, after all, voluntary organizations, churches, civic groups, local charities that could address immediate suffering. Why should Washington intervene? This view had merit in more prosperous times, in the context of ordinary business cycles, but the Depression was not ordinary, and the suffering was not localized. By 1931, unemployment had climbed past 8 million, a figure that would continue its grim ascent. Bread lines grew longer. Families doubled and tripled up in cramped apartments. Children went to school hungry. And Hoover, from the distance of the executive mansion, spoke of temporary hardship and the essential character-building qualities of adversity. Yet he was not entirely paralyzed by ideology. Recognizing that banks were collapsing at an alarming rate and that the financial system itself teetered on the edge of total seizure, Hoover did authorize the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in early 1932. This agency would loan money to banks, railroads, and large corporations, a measure that seemed to him both pragmatic and consistent with his philosophy. It supported institutions rather than individuals. It preserved the machinery of commerce without coddling those who had failed. The logic was that if the system remained functional, jobs would eventually return and relief would become unnecessary. But this measure, while it did prevent some of the worst financial catastrophe, only deepened a growing sense of resentment among ordinary Americans. Banks received government money while families lost their homes to foreclosure. Corporations obtained emergency credit while workers starved. The appearance of contradiction between the government's protective embrace of the wealthy and its cold indifference to the desperate would haunt Hoover and would, in the end, seal his political fate. Throughout 1931 and into 1932, Hoover's public image deteriorated with a speed that matched the economic decline. Photographs from the period show a man visibly aging, the lines of his face deepening, his eyes carrying a kind of bewildered exhaustion, as if he could not quite understand how his careful logic had collided so violently with reality. People began to speak of Hoovervilles with bitter irony. The shanty towns that sprawled across empty lots and under bridges were named for a president they blamed for their condition. Newspapers carried cartoons depicting him as out of touch, disconnected from the suffering occurring in streets he did not walk. His speeches, which attempted to frame the crisis as temporary and American resilience as inevitable, began to ring hollow, then harsh, then almost delusional, as unemployment continued its relentless climb toward 10 million, then higher still. By the time of the 1932 election year, a kind of collective exhaustion and hunger for change had settled over the American landscape. It was not violent revolution exactly, though some feared it might become so, but rather a deep, almost palpable sense that something fundamental had to shift. The old formulas had failed. The assurances had proven empty. Business as usual had led to unprecedented catastrophe. Farmers, their land seized for unpaid debts, organized resistance movements, and prevented foreclosure auctions. Veterans, angry and hungry, planned a march on Washington. Labor unrest, which had quieted somewhat in the 1920s, began to resurface with new intensity. The question circulating through American minds was no longer whether the economy would recover on its own, but whether the government and the entire economic system had any moral legitimacy at all. Hoover himself seemed to sense the turning tide. In his speeches, his tone shifted, still defending his policies but with an increasing urgency, almost a note of pleading, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his audience. He argued that premature government intervention might actually prolong the crisis, that American businessmen needed confidence more than capital, that relief programs would weaken the national character, even in the face of evidence that character was proving far less important than food and shelter. It was a consistency that bordered on tragedy, a man clinging to principle while the world rearranged itself around him. The American people, watching their savings evaporate, their jobs disappear, their dignity erode under the weight of involuntary idleness, had begun to ask a different question. What if government should intervene? What if it ought to? What if the market, left to itself, would not correct, but would instead continue its descent into darkness? These were revolutionary thoughts in the context of American political tradition, where the role of government had always been circumscribed, where the businessman had long been celebrated as the engine of prosperity. But necessity has a way of rewriting ideology, and by 1932, millions of Americans were prepared to embrace ideas they might have dismissed just 3 years earlier. The hunger for change was becoming palpable, almost audible, a murmur that would soon become a roar, and the election of that year would give voice to that longing for something, anything, different. By the winter of 1932, the nation had grown accustomed to a kind of numb despair. The market crash was no longer news. It was simply the backdrop of ordinary life, as fixed and inescapable as the weather. Soup lines wound around city blocks. Factories stood silent. In the countryside, farmers watched their land slip through their fingers, foreclosure notices arriving like winter frost. And yet, somewhere beneath the weight of collective helplessness, there stirred a quiet hunger for something different, for someone willing to say that things might change, that this descent need not continue forever. It was in this atmosphere that Franklin Delano Roosevelt began his campaign for the presidency in the spring of 1932. He was not unknown. He had served as governor of New York, had made a public name for himself despite the paralysis in his legs, a consequence of polio that confined him to a wheelchair. But what made Roosevelt distinct, what drew crowds and whispered hope through speakeasies and bread kitchens alike, was something harder to name. It was a kind of energy, a willingness to speak, as if the future were not predetermined, as if the government itself might bend and move to help the people who had been left behind. President Hoover, by contrast, had grown increasingly distant, speaking of rugged individualism and the dangers of government interference, his rhetoric growing thinner as conditions grew darker. The election itself, held on a Tuesday in early November of 1932, felt almost like a referendum on whether America would continue down the path it was on, or whether it would reach for something untried. Roosevelt won by a margin that stunned observers. He carried 42 of the 48 states. The popular vote was not even close. It was not so much a victory as it was a collective exhale, a signal from the American people that they were ready to try a different approach, ready to accept help, ready to believe that change was possible. But there remained a gap of more than 4 months between the election in November and the inauguration in March. Those months in late 1932 and early 1933 were among the most harrowing in American economic history. The banking system, which had been creaking and groaning all through the Depression, began to collapse. Banks across the country failed. People rushed to withdraw their savings before their banks closed, and in rushing, they ensured that more banks would close. It was a spiral without obvious end. By the time Roosevelt took office, the situation had become critical. The American economy was grinding nearly to a halt. The banking system, on which everything else depended, was on the verge of complete failure. Roosevelt's first act as president, even before his inaugural address, was to declare a bank holiday. He shut down every bank in America. The decision was extraordinary. In ordinary times, such a thing would have been unthinkable. But these were not ordinary times, and Roosevelt understood that you had to break the system to save it. You had to stop the bleeding before you could begin to heal. So the banks closed, and for a moment, the silent panic seemed to deepen. But then, on the evening of March 12, 1933, just 9 days into his presidency, Roosevelt sat down before a radio microphone. What happened next became known as the first of his fireside chats. Roosevelt's voice came through the speakers of radios across America, calm and warm and intimate, as if he were speaking directly to each family, in each home, with nothing between them but air and distance and the gentle medium of radio waves. He did not speak down to people. He did not speak in the formal, distant cadence of previous presidents. Instead, he spoke as a neighbor might speak, explaining the situation with clarity and without condescension, taking time to explain what had gone wrong with the banks, why it had been necessary to close them, and what would happen next. His tone suggested neither panic nor false confidence, but rather a kind of steady resolve. We will get through this. We can do this together. The effect was palpable. Across the nation, in homes lit by single electric bulbs, in apartments in the cities and farmhouses in the country, people listened, and they felt, for perhaps the first time since the crash, that someone who held power understood what they were experiencing and was willing to speak to them about it honestly. The panic did not vanish entirely, of course, but it shifted. It became something more bearable, something that could be faced with a kind of collective dignity. People began to hold on. They decided, in the moment after hearing his voice, that they would not rush to withdraw their money when the banks reopened. They would wait. They would trust. When the banks reopened 4 days later, the exodus did not materialize. Instead, people returned their money to the banks. Deposits were made. The immediate crisis passed, not because the underlying problems had been solved. They had not been solved in 4 days, but because people's perception of the situation had shifted. They felt seen, they felt heard, and they felt, crucially, that there was a government that was willing to act on their behalf. The fireside chats continued throughout Roosevelt's presidency, becoming a kind of ritual that Americans came to rely on. He gave 30 of them over his 12 years in office, and each one was an exercise in the art of governance through empathy and explanation. He did not always have good news to deliver. Sometimes he spoke of setbacks and challenges that lay ahead. But his fundamental message remained constant. We are in this together, and we will find our way through. And alongside these words came action. Within the first few weeks of his administration, Roosevelt began to implement what he called the New Deal, a program so vast and so multifaceted that it would eventually reshape the relationship between the American government and the American people in ways that would endure for decades. But the New Deal was not born simply from ideology or theory. It was born from the conviction that the government had a responsibility to act, to step in, to provide relief and recovery and reform. It was born from the understanding that when the existing systems had failed, when people were suffering, when the basic machinery of the economy had broken down, the government could not simply stand aside and hope that things would improve on their own. The first weeks and months of 1933 were a time of feverish activity in Washington. Bills were drafted and debated and passed with remarkable speed. The sense of emergency that gripped the nation seemed to clear away the usual obstacles and objections. There was a widespread feeling, even among those who were skeptical of government intervention, that something had to be done. The old ways had not worked. The old thinking had not worked. It was time to try something new. And so Roosevelt's election, and the tone that he brought to the presidency, and the willingness to speak to the American people with honesty and compassion became the opening through which a new kind of government could emerge. The crash and the depression had broken something that had seemed solid and permanent. Roosevelt understood that in that breaking lay an opportunity. You could not rebuild the same structure, but you could, perhaps, build something stronger, something that protected people in ways the old system had not. The question was not whether change would come. The change had already happened. The question was what shape it would take. And in Roosevelt's voice, steady and certain through the radio waves, the American people heard the possibility of an answer. When Franklin Roosevelt took office on that cold March morning in 1933, the nation was not simply wounded. It was paralyzed by a kind of collective bewilderment that had settled into the bones of millions. The banks were closed, the bread lines stretched around city blocks, and somewhere in the Oval Office, a president in a wheelchair began to imagine something that had never quite existed before in American life. A government that would not simply hope for recovery, but would deliberately build it, piece by piece, with the hands and minds of ordinary people. The architects of what would become known as the New Deal understood something almost instinctively. The crash had broken not only the economy, but the very sense that tomorrow would be better than today. And so rather than waiting for markets to heal themselves, they began to construct a new kind of scaffolding around American life. It was not socialism, though many feared it might become so. It was, instead, a pragmatic improvisation, a willingness to try, to learn, to adjust, as if the entire nation had become one vast, uncertain experiment in human recovery. The Works Progress Administration, or the WPA as it came to be known, represented perhaps the most ambitious and immediately visible of these efforts. Picture, if you will, the autumn of 1935. Across the country, in small towns and great cities alike, men gathered with shovels and hammers, not because employers had suddenly grown generous, but because the federal government had decided that idle hands and idle minds were a national emergency. The WPA would ultimately employ millions. Some estimates suggest as many as 3.7 million at its height, building roads and bridges and schools and hospitals, many of which still stand today. There is something quietly profound in this, that a man could go to work in the morning, earn wages that would feed his family, and by doing so, create something tangible and lasting. The roads he helped to pave would outlive him by decades. The schoolhouse he helped to build would educate children who were not yet born. But the WPA was never merely about labor. Among its divisions was something called Federal One, a program so unusual for its time that it is easy to forget how radical it truly was. This was the government's investment in the arts, not as luxury, but as sustenance for the human spirit. Writers were hired to document the oral histories of enslaved people, creating an archive that would preserve voices and memories that might otherwise have been lost forever. Painters and sculptors received commissions to create public murals and monuments. Theatre companies received funding to stage productions that reached audiences in towns where Broadway might as well have been on another continent. Musicians found work performing for audiences who could not afford concert tickets. In a moment when survival seemed uncertain, the government of the United States made the deliberate choice to say that beauty and culture and storytelling were not frivolous luxuries. They were part of what it meant to be human, part of what was worth recovering. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, operated from a different philosophical foundation, though it served a similar purpose. This program, which drew young men from the cities and towns of America, sent them into the forests and mountains and wildlands of the nation. They planted trees, billions of them, eventually, and they built fire towers and cleared trails and worked to restore lands that had been damaged by careless extraction and clearing. There was something almost therapeutic about it, one might imagine. A young man from a crowded tenement in Brooklyn, or a farm boy from Oklahoma, with nothing left to farm, finding himself in the wilderness, with tools in his hands and the knowledge that his work was creating something that would persist. The CCC was, in many ways, a conversation between the government and its young men that said, "You are not discardable, your labor matters, and the land itself is something worth caring for." Both the WPA and the CCC were immediate interventions, emergency measures designed to put money into pockets and purpose into lives within months. But the New Deal also contained within it something more structural, more permanent. Social Security, passed in 1935, represented perhaps the most fundamental shift in the relationship between the American government and its citizens since the founding of the Republic. Before Social Security, old age was a catastrophe for most people. You worked until you could not work, and then you hoped that your children or your community would care for you. If they could not or would not, you faced poverty and dependence. Social Security, with its modest pensions funded by a tax on wages, made a simple but revolutionary promise: you would not be abandoned. After a lifetime of work, you would receive a stipend from the government itself, funded by the contributions you had made throughout your working years. It was, in essence, a form of insurance against the ultimate indignity of poverty in old age. When we think of this now, from a vantage point more than 90 years in the future, it can be difficult to grasp how genuinely transformative such a promise was. The psychological effect should not be underestimated. Older people had been living in a kind of chronic fear. The security that Social Security offered was not merely financial, it was existential. It meant that the future was not entirely unknowable. It meant that dignity in old age was not dependent on the charity of others or the luck of circumstance. It meant that you could imagine tomorrow. The banking reforms enacted during Roosevelt's first 100 days operated on a similar principle, though they addressed a different sort of fear. The bank runs that had characterized the early years of the Depression were not simply matters of economics. They were expressions of collective terror. People rushed to withdraw their money because they did not believe their money was safe in the banks. And once enough people became convinced that a bank was failing, their very actions could make it so. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The solution that the New Deal architects implemented was multifaceted. First, they declared a nationwide bank holiday, closing all the banks and giving the government time to audit them and determine which were sound and which were not. It was a dramatic intervention, but it served a purpose. It created a moment of pause, a space in which panic could not continue its exponential growth. When the banks reopened, they did so under new regulations. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, created by the Banking Act of 1933, guaranteed deposits up to a certain amount, initially $2,500, which represented a substantial sum at that time. This guarantee meant that a depositor could put money into a bank without fear that it would simply vanish if the bank encountered difficulties. The psychological impact was enormous. People began to believe, once again, that their savings were safe. Money that had been hidden under mattresses and buried in backyards began to return to the banking system. Credit, which had frozen solid during the crisis, began to thaw. These programs did not operate in isolation. They formed an interconnected web, each supporting the others. The WPA put money into people's pockets, and those people spent that money in local stores, which meant that shopkeepers had customers again and could pay their suppliers, who could in turn pay their employees. The CCC removed young men from the cities, which reduced labor competition and created opportunities for others, while simultaneously creating an emotional investment in public lands that would persist far into the future. Social Security provided hope to aging workers, which made them less desperate, which changed the political and social temperature of the nation. The banking reforms restored faith in the financial system itself, which meant that business people could plan for the future without living in constant dread. Were these programs perfect? Were they sufficient to immediately restore prosperity? The answer to both questions would be no. The depression would persist, in various forms, throughout the 1930s. Unemployment would remain stubbornly high. In 1937, the economy would actually contract again, a phenomenon that historians sometimes refer to as the Roosevelt recession, during which many of the gains made in the preceding years seemed to evaporate. There were critics who argued that the New Deal did not go far enough, that more radical measures were necessary. There were others who argued that it went too far, that it represented a dangerous expansion of federal power. Both perspectives contained elements of truth, perhaps, and both overlooked something essential, that the New Deal, whatever its limitations, had fundamentally altered the conversation about what government could do, what government should do, and what Americans could ask of their government during times of crisis. The programs themselves were experiments. They were never intended to be permanent solutions, but in creating them, in implementing them, in observing how people responded to them, the architects of the New Deal were learning something about human nature and about the nature of economic systems that would shape policy for generations to come. The WPA would eventually wind down, but the infrastructure it created would endure. The CCC would transform the American landscape in ways that are still visible today, nearly a century later. Social Security would become, and would remain, perhaps the most popular government program in American history, so popular, in fact, that it became nearly untouchable, a third rail that politicians approached only at great peril. And as these programs took root, as they spread across the country, as millions of people found work and purpose and dignity in them, something subtle but profound began to shift in the national consciousness. The sense of helplessness that had characterized the depths of the Depression began, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, to lift. It did not happen overnight. It could not have happened overnight, but it happened nonetheless, in the patient accumulation of small certainties, small securities, small reasons to believe that tomorrow might indeed be better than today. And yet, even as the economic machinery ground to a halt across the nation, something unexpected happened in the darkened theaters and living rooms of America. The very hardship that stripped away material comfort seemed to open a door to a different kind of nourishment, one that could not be repossessed, could not depreciate, could not be taken away by a failing bank. It was the hunger for story, for music, for the momentary escape into worlds where struggle could be transformed into something bearable, even beautiful. The movie houses became sanctuaries during these years. A ticket cost a quarter, or sometimes even a dime if you went on what theaters called a lucky day, a promotion designed specifically to lure those with almost nothing to spend. Families saved their coins, pooled their resources, and on a Saturday afternoon or a weeknight when the weight of uncertainty felt too heavy, they would file into those grand lobbies with their ornate mirrors and plush carpets, spaces designed to make even the poorest visitor feel, for a moment, like they belonged to something grander than their circumstances. The usher would take their ticket, the lights would dim, and for 2 hours or more, the outside world simply ceased to exist. What is it about cinema that seems to heal, at least temporarily, the wounds of a broken world? Historians and film scholars have pondered this question, and perhaps there is no single answer, but the pattern was undeniable. During the Depression, Americans watched more films than ever before or since. The industry had feared that economic collapse would destroy their audience, and yet something quite opposite occurred. As income shrank, as the future darkened, the desire to sit in a theater and watch a story unfold became almost desperate, almost sacred. The kinds of stories that thrived during these years reveal something profound about the national psyche. There were the great musicals, elaborate, colorful productions where dancers moved in impossible synchronicity, where music swelled to fill every corner of the screen, where the human body itself became a kind of argument against despair. Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers glided across polished floors in films whose very title seemed like a promise. Top Hat, Swing Time, Follow the Fleet. In these films there was always grace, always elegance, always a world in which a man and woman could find their way to happiness through a perfect series of steps. The sets were vast and gleaming, the costumes impossible elaborate, and if none of it was real, well, that was rather the point. Reality had become too difficult to bear. Then there were the comedies, and the comedies perhaps served a different but equally important purpose. The Marx Brothers hurled anarchic nonsense at authority and convention with a ferocity that felt almost revolutionary to audiences who had learned to resent the systems that had failed them. Laurel and Hardy got themselves into elaborate predicaments that somehow always seemed to mirror, in miniature, the tragedies of everyday life, but with the crucial difference that their disasters ended in laughter rather than ruin. There was something deeply subversive about laughing at chaos when you were living in chaos. It suggested that the chaos could be survived, even savored, even transformed into entertainment. And then there were the dramas, which offered their own kind of solace. They did not necessarily provide happy endings, though many did, but rather they offered something perhaps even more valuable, the suggestion that suffering was not shameful, that difficulty could be met with dignity, that ordinary people possessed depths of character that were only revealed through hardship. Audiences watched stories of individuals rising above circumstance, or enduring circumstance with grace, and they felt seen. Their own struggles, their own quiet losses, seemed to matter in a way that the collapse of the stock market had suggested they no longer did. The radio, meanwhile, had transformed the home itself into a theatre. Every evening at a particular hour, families would gather around the wooden box with its warm amber light and listen to stories unfold through voice and sound alone. There was something intimate about this form of entertainment, something that required the listener's imagination to complete. You could picture the scenes in whatever way your mind preferred. The detective show Gangbusters brought crime to the living room, with sound effects of sirens and gunfire and dramatic musical stings. The soap operas unfolded day after day, following characters through romantic entanglements and moral crises that seemed, to regular listeners, almost as real as their own lives. Amos and Andy became a cultural phenomenon, though it is now recognized that much of what made it popular was also deeply troubling in its racial caricature, a complexity that was largely invisible to audiences at the time, though it would eventually demand historical reckoning. But perhaps most powerful were the variety programs and the talent shows that brought actual musicians into the home. A working family in a tenement in Chicago could hear Bessie Smith sing the blues, could hear the swing bands that had emerged from African American communities and were now spreading through the entire nation. Duke Ellington conducted his orchestra on radio broadcasts that were heard in every time zone, across every social divide. Music had become democratic in a way it had never been before, available to anyone with a radio receiver, which by the Depression years meant nearly everyone. Why is music so essential to the human spirit? One might argue, based on what happened during these years, that it is because music speaks to something deeper than circumstance, something that exists in the body itself, in the rhythm of the heart, in the involuntary movement of the foot. And music itself, jazz, swing, blues, country, folk, was undergoing a remarkable transformation. The jazz age was giving way to the swing era, and though the economic depression did not create these forms, it seemed to deepen them, to infuse them with a new kind of emotional weight. The blues, which had always been born from hardship, seemed especially suited to these times. A blues song articulated pain in a way that was somehow more bearable than silence. It acknowledged suffering without being destroyed by it. It suggested that trouble was a universal language, that the woman singing in a Memphis recording studio and the man listening in a rural cabin in Arkansas were speaking to each other across distance, saying, "I know what you are experiencing. I have been through it too. You are not alone. The phonograph record became another form of salvation for those with a few cents to spare. A record cost perhaps 35 cents, and it could be played over and over, each time bringing the same song into your home. Some people spent what little extra money they had collecting records, building small libraries of music that represented an inner world of taste and identity. In a society that had stripped away so much, jobs, savings, security, status, the ability to choose music, to surround oneself with songs that mattered, became a way of asserting that some part of the self remained sovereign. And then there were the libraries, those remarkable public institutions that asked nothing but a library card, and even that cost nothing. Libraries became gathering places and sanctuaries. A book borrowed for free was a form of resistance against the notion that culture belonged only to the wealthy. A child who spent an afternoon in a library, losing themselves in a story, was a child who was not on the street corner begging, was not witnessing their parents' despair in the cramped spaces of an inadequate home. The works of the great authors were available to anyone, and during the Depression, people read with an intensity that surprised librarians and publishers alike. There was a hunger for literature, for narrative, for poetry that suggested that the national conversation about value and worth was not, after all, limited to the price of stocks. This is not to suggest that culture was equally available to all. Racial segregation meant that African American communities and white communities experienced entertainment separately, even when they were listening to the same radio broadcasts. The great theaters were often segregated, with black patrons relegated to balconies if they were admitted at all. The record industry promoted white musicians who copied the styles developed by black musicians, often crediting only the white performers. The newspapers that carried film reviews and music criticism were not accessible to those who could not read, and literacy itself was unevenly distributed along lines of race, region, and class. And yet, even with all these limitations and injustices, something remarkable was happening. The expansion of cultural experience was outpacing the capacity of systems of exclusion to contain it. The Depression, paradoxically, may have created the conditions for a more integrated cultural moment than might otherwise have occurred. When people have nothing else, they turn to what is free or nearly free, and what is free respects no boundaries. A radio broadcast cannot distinguish between the races of those listening. A library card opens the same stacks to everyone who can get inside. Music, once recorded and broadcast, cannot be resegregated after the fact. The culture itself was becoming in small but significant ways more permeable than the rigid social structures that had supposedly contained it. And so, as the 1930s deepened, as unemployment rose and hope seemed more distant, the arts became not a luxury that fell away, but something closer to a necessity. In this, there is something deeply human and deeply resilient, the capacity to make meaning, to find beauty, to tell stories and listen to stories. These are not amenities that can be dispensed with in times of plenty and abandoned in times of scarcity. They are perhaps most essential precisely when everything else has been stripped away. They are the things that remind us that we are more than our economic circumstances, that we contain depths, that survival is not the only reason to be alive. By the middle of the 1930s, something imperceptible had begun to shift in the American consciousness. A slow turning of the tide that was neither sudden nor dramatic, but rather like a tide moving beneath the surface of daily life, pulling the nation gradually back towards something resembling equilibrium. The statistics would tell one story: unemployment rates beginning their descent from the catastrophic peaks of 1933, when 1 in 4 Americans had no work. By 1936 and 1937, that number had fallen to perhaps 1 in 6, and while this still represented profound suffering for millions, it was nonetheless a direction that suggested possibility rather than endless collapse. The stock market, too, had begun to recover. not without setbacks and tremors, not without the scars of recent memory making investors move with far greater caution than before, but recover it did, climbing steadily if unevenly through the second half of the decade. And yet the numbers alone cannot capture what had truly transformed during those years of slow ascent. Something deeper had moved in the American mind, a fundamental reordering of what people believed to be true about themselves, about the system in which they lived, and about the relationship between an individual and the machinery of state and commerce. The crash had been a revelation of a kind, a moment when the comfortable mythology of the 1920s, the idea that any person with pluck and determination could accumulate endless wealth, that markets always rose because that was their nature, that poverty was primarily a moral failing rather than an accident of circumstance, had been stripped away with devastating finality. In its place emerged something slower to articulate, but perhaps more durable, a wariness, a skepticism, a recognition that systems could fail, that fortunes built on confidence alone were fragile as paper. Consider the question that many Americans found themselves asking in these recovery years. If the world could change so completely in the matter of a single afternoon, what did that mean for how one should live? The answer many arrived at was neither reckless nor fearful, but rather careful. Families who had lost everything and slowly rebuilt began to save their money differently, keeping it not invested in distant enterprises but in banks with federal insurance, in bonds issued by the government, in modest accounts that might not earn much but would not vanish overnight. The speculative fervor that had gripped even the poorest neighborhoods of the 1920s, that fever of buying stocks on margin, of believing that yesterday's price was a guarantee of tomorrow's rise, had largely burned itself out, leaving behind a population that had learned, through bitter experience, to distinguish between hope and delusion. This new caution extended to credit as well. The easy lending that had fueled consumption in the 1920s had nearly destroyed the banking system and had certainly destroyed millions of households. Americans emerged from the early 1930s with a deep, visceral suspicion of debt that would persist for decades, a wariness that shaped not only individual choices but entire cultural attitudes. The idea that one should only borrow for a home, and only if one could reasonably expect to pay it back, became something closer to received wisdom than mere prudence. Installment buying, which had seemed so modern and exciting in the 1920s, now felt vaguely dangerous, a harbinger of the chaos that could sweep through one's life if one was not eternally vigilant. And what of the government? Here perhaps the most profound transformation occurred, though again it was gradual, emerging not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow recognition born of necessity and desperation. The prevailing view of the 1920s had held that government should largely stay out of economic matters, that the market would self-correct, that the best policy was one of minimal intervention. This belief had been tested, fractured really, by the simple fact that the market had not corrected itself. For 4 years the economy had sunk deeper, despite assurances that recovery was near, that the fundamentals were sound. By 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took office and began the aggressive interventionism of the New Deal, a vast majority of Americans supported the shift. They had learned through their own experience that invisible hands did not always guide markets toward equilibrium. Sometimes, invisible hands needed help, or at least they needed supervision. This shift in attitude represented something almost philosophical, a change in how Americans understood causation and responsibility. The wealthy and the powerful had often blamed the Depression on external shocks, on overconfidence among ordinary people, on the inevitable cycles of business. But from the perspective of a factory worker or a farmer facing ruin, the Depression looked less like a natural phenomenon and more like something that should have been prevented, or at minimum, mitigated by those with knowledge and power. If bankers had taken dangerous risks and they had brought the whole system down, then perhaps bankers ought to be regulated. If stock prices could be inflated by speculation and lies, then perhaps the markets ought to have oversight. If businesses would cut wages to the bone and lay off workers en masse, perhaps workers ought to be protected by laws setting minimum standards and protecting the right to organize. The New Deal programs gave institutional form to these emerging beliefs. The Securities and Exchange Commission began to regulate the stock market, imposing disclosure requirements and banning the worst manipulative practices that had preceded the crash. The Social Security Act created a safety net that guaranteed some minimal support for the elderly and disabled, recognition of a collective obligation to care for citizens who could not care for themselves. Banking regulations, deposit insurance, and other safeguards made the financial system less likely to collapse in a panic. Unions, protected by the National Labor Relations Act, grew stronger, allowing workers to bargain collectively for wages and conditions. None of these changes happened painlessly or without considerable opposition from those who saw in them a dangerous expansion of government power. But they happened, and they persisted, because a sufficiently large portion of the American population had learned, through months or years of hardship, that some regulation and collective action seemed preferable to the unmediated chaos of an unregulated market. What had shifted then was not merely economic policy, but a fundamental understanding of what security meant and where one ought to seek it. In the 1920s, the path to security had seemed to lie in individual initiative, in buying stocks, in climbing the ladder of success before someone else did. By the late 1930s, security looked different. It looked like a job with a company that would keep you employed because labor laws and public opinion made layoffs a last resort. It looked like a pension, either from your employer or eventually from Social Security. It looked like savings that were insured by the government, a physical amount of money in a bank that would not disappear if that bank failed. It looked, perhaps most importantly, like the existence of a collective framework, a shared understanding that economic life was not purely a matter of individual struggle, but something that could and should be structured to protect people from complete catastrophe. These changes would not, of course, prevent future economic downturns. Recessions would come. The Depression itself would not end until war production ramped up in the early 1940s. But the psychological and institutional architecture that emerged from the 1929 crash and its aftermath represented a different bargain than had been offered before. The state would play a larger role in economic life, would actively intervene to prevent the worst outcomes, would accept some responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. In exchange, people would accept some limits on their fortunes, some regulations, some taxation to fund the collective goods. Whether that bargain was good or bad is perhaps a matter for argument, but it was certainly new, and it reflected a deep learning carved into the national psyche by the experience of ruin and recovery. As the 1930s drew toward their close, there was a sense among many Americans that something had been reclaimed, not all that had been lost. Some people never did fully recover financially from the Depression, but something more fundamental, a sense that one understood the world more clearly now, that the myths of the 1920s had been exposed as just that, myths. The belief in endless progress and ever-rising prosperity had been tempered by the recognition of cycles, of limits, of the possibility of sudden, catastrophic loss. And alongside this darker knowledge had grown something else, a modest hopefulness, not the giddy optimism of the boom years, but something quieter, more considered. The belief that if one could learn from disaster, if one could build systems that distributed risk rather than concentrating it, if one could acknowledge interdependence rather than celebrating only individual success, then perhaps one could avoid repeating such horrors. The shadow of the crash would linger for decades, shaping choices and policies, but it would be a shadow that carried its own kind of wisdom, and so the dust of that October afternoon has long since settled. The buildings still stand on Wall Street, their brass doors polished by 1,000 hands each day, but the weight of what happened inside them in 1929 has never quite lifted from the air. Time has a peculiar way of softening sharp edges, turning catastrophe into history, turning history into a kind of distant music that plays in the background of our collective consciousness. We hear its echoes still, in the way people speak of markets and risk, in the caution that enters the voice when the economy shifts, in the quiet fear that lives somewhere in the memory of a nation that watched everything disappear in a matter of hours. What strikes us, perhaps, as we look back across nearly a century, is not the precision of the numbers, the $16 billion lost in those 10 days of October, the unemployment that would eventually claim a quarter of the working population, but rather the human experience woven through those numbers. A man in suspenders, standing on a street corner, watching the headlines change in the window of a newsstand, trying to understand how a fortune measured in thousands could become nothing. A woman opening a letter from a bank, the words sliding past her eyes the first time, the second time, until suddenly they arrange themselves into meaning. There is nothing left. A child asking a parent why they are moving to a smaller house, and the parent having no answer that would make sense. These moments did not disappear. They became part of the story that America tells itself about itself. Not a story of easy prosperity or unbroken confidence, but rather a more complex narrative about fragility and resilience living side by side. The decade that followed the crash taught the nation something it had nearly forgotten in the giddy brightness of the 20s, that security is not guaranteed, that what appears solid might shift beneath your feet, that the life you have built can be unmade not by your own failure, but by forces far larger and more distant than yourself. And yet there is something else in that story too, something that complicates the simple tale of ruin. For even as the Depression deepened, as the breadlines grew longer, and the shanty towns spread like sad gardens across the country, people continued. They made music in rooms with no heat. They told stories to children gathered in the dark. They shared the last portions of meager meals. They organized, they resisted, they refused the invitation to despair. Perhaps this too is part of what we have inherited from that era, not just the memory of loss, but the possibility of continuing in the face of loss. The economists and historians have spent decades unpacking the causes, searching through the wreckage for the precise moment when things began to fall. Too much speculation, credit extended too freely, wealth distributed too unevenly, certain structural flaws in the banking system that no one had quite anticipated. And all of these explanations hold truth. Systems do matter. The rules by which we play the game of commerce and trade shape the outcomes. A crash born of particular choices is a crash that might have been prevented, or at least softened, by different choices. But there is something almost peaceful in recognizing how little control we ultimately possess. We live inside systems we did not design, inheriting the consequences of decisions made by people we will never meet, facing futures shaped by currents too large to see clearly while we are swimming in them. The brokers who filled the trading floor in October of 1929 believed they were making rational decisions based on available information. They believed they were riding a train that would not stop. They were wrong, but not in any way that seems foreign to us now. We too make our choices, assess our risks, place our bets on futures we cannot quite see. We too believe that the momentum of the present will carry us safely forward. Perhaps this is the true legacy of 1929 and the Depression years that followed. Not a warning etched in stone telling us exactly what to avoid, but something subtler and more human, an acknowledgement that the world contains more complexity than we typically account for, that our moment of prosperity is always only one moment among many, that the ground beneath us shifts whether we are paying attention or not, and that even when it shifts dramatically, even when certainty dissolves into chaos, even when the life you knew is replaced by something you did not choose, there remains within the human spirit a capacity to gather the pieces, to imagine something different, to find meaning in small kindnesses and continued effort. The tickers have long since fallen silent, their mechanical chatter replaced by electronic impulses we cannot hear. The brokers and investors of that era have passed into history, their names preserved only in records and memoirs. The Hoovervilles have vanished. The farmers who watched their topsoil blow away have become ancestors. Yet something of what they experienced remains with us, not as a prophecy, but as a kind of testament. It tells us that systems change, that stability can be an illusion, that we are all more vulnerable than we wish to believe. But it also tells us something quieter, something that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the whole shape of the story. Despite the crash, despite the depression, despite the grinding hardship and loss, the nation continued. It changed. It learned. New systems were built with new rules designed to prevent, or at least to slow, the next catastrophe. Not perfectly. No system is ever perfect, but with intention and care. The capacity to fail did not disappear, but it was acknowledged, incorporated into the design. We became, perhaps, a little wiser about our own fragility. As you sit with this history now, in whatever stillness surrounds you, perhaps you might consider how the lessons of that distant autumn continue to shape our lives. Not in obvious ways, not in ways that demand constant vigilance, but in the background of our assumptions about risk and caution, about saving and spending, about the role of government in protecting those who fall through the cracks of the marketplace. These are not new questions. They were being asked in breadlines and around dinner tables throughout the 1930s. They are being asked still, and there is something oddly comforting in that continuity, is there not? The fact that we have not solved these problems once and for all does not mean we are failing. It means we are human, participating in an endless conversation about how to live together, how to build systems that serve everyone, how to balance ambition with security, growth with stability. The people who lived through 1929 passed that conversation along to us, just as we will pass it along to those who come after. The crash did not end the world. The depression did not destroy the capacity for hope or industry or love. What happened in October of 1929 and the years that followed has receded into history, but only because we have continued past it, carrying its lessons with us like stones in our pockets, remembering what they taught us without needing to touch them constantly. That too is a kind of wisdom, not the sharp remembrance of trauma, but the gentle persistence of learned caution, the quiet resilience of a people who knows it is vulnerable but chooses to build anyway. And so the evening continues. The buildings still stand, the markets still rise and fall, people still buy and sell, still dream and plan, still fear and hope. The ticker tape of history keeps moving forward, recording moments that will someday seem as distant as October 1929 seems to us now. What we do with this knowledge, how we hold it, how we learn from it, how we let it guide us towards slightly wiser choices, is perhaps the real story, the one that continues on, that will not end because we are still living it. Rest now in that thought. The past has already happened. The future will arrive on its own. For now, there is only this moment, this breath, this gentle falling away into sleep.